Chapter 396. Sillin didn't stay for the post-battle meeting. G-Phone was busy with his healing, so he couldn't attend to the post-battle meeting for now. Therefore, Sillin left with Cheto and Hui Mao after informing Stanley that he was going to leave. Stanley didn't bother with Sillin either. G-Phone had said that Sillin could do whatever he wanted, so there was no need for him to interfere. Moreover, Stanley was actually very wary of Sillin after this incident. Now that Sillin was gone, he didn't have to face him anymore. He let out a sigh of relief. Yudi took Sillin's place to participate in the post-battle summary meeting. Right now, the 11th Squad was under Yudi's command. Shikai and Shimu were busy upgrading their robots. Last time, they were halfway through the upgrade, but they hadn't finished yet. This time, they received some new data and information. Both Shikai and Shimu were busy upgrading their robots. Their data and information were all derived from actual combat. The data they obtained from this battle was very meaningful, and it was a good opportunity for them to upgrade their robots once more. After the meeting, Yudi and the rest of the 11th Squad returned to the base to rest and reorganize. Their armor needed some repairs, and Carrie's group needed time to get used to each other. Not only did they need to repair the hardware, but they also needed a heart-to-heart talk with each other. Everyone was tired after the battle, so it was time for a good rest. Hey, don't you think our captain needs to rest? Xiaoshang leaned on the railing and said lazily to Carrie, who was busy repairing the fighter in the workshop below. How would I know? Our captain is a busy man, but we don't need to worry about that. We just need to improve ourselves. Carrie knew very well why Sillin had only brought Cheto and Wheeze with him. One reason was because of the secrecy of their mission, and the other reason was because of the level of danger. Although they were above average compared to other hunters, they were nothing compared to Sillin and Cheto. He circled around the starship once before sitting down at a corner. No one knew what he was thinking. Hey, Ayu, why are you daydreaming again? Behind him, Zoel and Sigma flew over as well. The four of them had been working together all this time. The light on Ayu's face flickered, and he said in a deep voice, I'm thinking about life. All right, keep thinking, but don't overdo it. The starship system is still in the process of upgrading. Be careful not to ruin Little 11. You know, when we think too seriously, it will affect the surrounding machinery, Rufius said, his tone clearly rising. Zoel said coldly, Don't say that with a smug tone. There's nothing to be proud of. Ruifia, who was feeling pleased with himself, was choked by Zol's cold water. While the 11th Squad was busy with their own business, Sillin, Cheto, and Hui Mao were secretly traveling to Sector X. Sector X hadn't changed much. If anything, it would be that the sector had returned to its former bleak state. There was a time when the tourism planets in Sector X were mined, and it had boosted the population and economy of the sector. Many people's lives had changed because of the tourism planets. Their labor force was cheap, but at least they finally found a way to sell it cheaply. Unlike the beginning, when they couldn't even sell their cheap labor force. When Sillin brought Hui Mao and Tang Qiuqiu here, Sector X was at its busiest in the last few decades. However, the liveliness didn't last long before the League of Stars' war began. After the Fenier's family's little garden and other tourism planets were half closed, Sector X returned to its former bleak state. Of course, this bleak state was only relative to a trade sector. The people living in Saturn's sector were used to this bleak state since a long time ago. To them, it wasn't much of a change. Sillin looked at the coded message he just received on his communicator and had Cheto drive the space plane into the planet. Sillin was all too familiar with planet Brown Earth. He didn't even need to look at the satellite map to know which places were suitable for landing. The satellite array outside the planet was still the same as before. However, Sillin was no longer afraid of these sky eyes that the people on the planet feared. He didn't need to do anything himself. Be it Hui Mao or Cheto, they could easily take care of these sky eyes and avoid their surveillance. Compared to some of the more complicated surveillance equipment he had experienced before, planet Brown Earth sky eyes looked too ordinary. After avoiding all kinds of surveillance, their small spaceplane landed in a remote and barren area. There was a forest here, and the growth of the trees wasn't good. Due to the environment, it was impossible for them to grow densely. However, for Sillin, This didn't affect their space plane's landing and concealment. After leaving the space plane, it turned invisible on its own. Very few people came to this area, and even if they did, they might not be able to discover the space plane parked here. Where are we going first? Crouching on Silen's shoulder, Hui Mao moved his claws. He was getting bored again, and his claws were itchy if he didn't find something to do. Silen looked at his communicator. Right now, Yuling Long only knew that Sambot was on this planet, but she didn't know his specific location. Unless Sambot contacted Silen of his own accord, or Silen found Sambot directly. The strange thing was that if Sambot's situation was really bad, he should have accepted Yuling Long's good intentions and contacted Silen. But he didn't, which meant that Sambot's situation wasn't too bad. Moreover, Sambot was guarded against Yuling Long, so he had no intention of accepting Yuling Long's good intentions for now. It seemed that Sambot really was very dissatisfied and distrustful of the Yu family. Never mind, let's wait for a while. Silen looked around and said, I'm going back to take a look. Ah, you mean that rundown town? Hui Mao had a pretty deep impression of that place. He felt that Silen's birthplace wasn't as good as his. Yes, that's the place. Hui Mao's ears drooped. Although he didn't say anything, his reaction alone was enough to tell how unwilling he was. He was only enduring it for Silen's sake. Silen smiled and patted Hui Mao's head. There might be some changes this time. What changes? I don't even have a place to live, muttered Hui Mao. Have you forgotten? When I came here a few years ago, I bought an abandoned housing area and had people renovate it. Hui Mao's ears perked up the moment Silen mentioned this. He remembered that the secret purchase was made with his help and tampered with some system data. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been so easy to take down the area without Silen's help. Hui Mao snorted twice when he thought of that. Then let's go. It's free to live in my own place anyway. Cheto, is he implying that I'm going to buy cat food with the money I'm saving? Actually, Hui Mao wasn't just trying to save money. He knew that there was a territory that belonged to him that he hadn't marked or patrolled yet. Other than the prosperous city and civilian district, there was also a desolate area bordered by the peaceful civilian district. Silen and the others had landed in this desolate area. They walked straight ahead, and it didn't take long before they saw the poor houses at the edge. No one noticed that Silen and the others were a lot less populated than before. Some of the houses had collapsed, and it looked like no one had lived in them for a long time. However, in the direction of the city, there were some newly built houses. Some of the people who sold their labor at a low price had saved enough money to build a new house here. This place was close to the city, which gave them a sense of superiority. They felt that they were superior compared to the people in the center of the civilian area. The abandoned houses Silen bought were located at the center of the civilian district. According to Silen's design, the builders had built the place very well. After demolishing the abandoned houses, they built a big courtyard that looked similar to the one in the wilderness. The only difference was that this courtyard wasn't decorated with any fancy decorations, and the colors were a little dull. The two-story building in the courtyard wasn't very eye-catching even on a satellite map. All of this was done with Silen's own money. He didn't use the 11 squad's funds or Hui Mao's cat food money. Silen had earned all of it by hunting and completing missions himself. Moreover, the cost of living here wasn't high to begin with, and this was the civilian district. It didn't cost much to build the place. The population here was even smaller than before. Most of the people who participated in the development of the tourist planet had migrated, and some of them had disappeared without a trace. No one knew if they were still alive or not. The rest of them squeezed into the city as much as they could, and those who couldn't fit into the city set up camp near the city. Compared to what he saw the last time he came here, there were many more abandoned houses. Hui Mao had already jumped into the courtyard when Silen walked over. The protective walls of the courtyard were nothing to Hui Mao, and he didn't even need a key card to enter. Even though Hui Mao didn't like the conditions here, it was still his territory. After rubbing his scent and making some markings, Hui Mao jumped back on Silen's shoulder and pointed at the abandoned houses around them. Silen, let's buy all of these too. Let's build a bigger courtyard. I'm going to buy all of these. Silen didn't enter the courtyard to take a closer look. Instead, he walked in another direction. There was a small shop there. It was the tavern that Silen rented out. The tavern's business wasn't good. One could tell from the counter that very few people came here. Laughter came from inside the tavern. It came from both adults and children. When Sillin walked into the tavern, the welcome screen at the entrance didn't light up. It had been stopped, and there was no need to waste electricity when it was so popular. "Welcome, what can I do for you?" A middle-aged man with green stubble walked out of the tavern. His face looked a little weathered, but he was in good spirits. There was a smile in his eyes, but when he saw Sillin, he froze for a moment and forgot what he was going to say. "Long time no see, 20%. Sillin greeted him with a smile before sitting down next to a round wooden table. Cheto sat down at another table and didn't disturb Sillin and 20%'s conversation. Hui Mao was about to jump onto the counter and walk around when Cheto pulled him away. Sillin had rented out this tavern to 20% the first time he left. The last time he came here, the tavern's business wasn't this bad, and 20%'s life wasn't bad either. But obviously, it wasn't the same anymore. The counter was very clean, and it was obvious that the owner cleaned it every day. The wine bottles were also very clean, but some unnoticed dust at the corner exposed the truth. "It's pretty hard right now, isn't it?" Sillin said. Sillin, is it really you?" 20% finally came to himself and found it a little hard to believe. After all, it had been years since Sillin left. Although he rented out the tavern, Sillin had never asked about the tavern situation, be it when it was profitable or when it was in dire straits these past 2 years. After Sillin nodded in confirmation, 20% chuckled. "You don't look like you've changed much." 20% wasn't much older than Sillin, but now that the two of them were standing side by side, people would believe them if they said they were father and son. The difference in lifespan caused by the environment they grew up in and their genetic rank made up for this difference. Sillin chatted with 20% about the changes that had happened here in the past few years. Now, 20% was married and had a child, living the same life as his parents. 20%'s wife came out to entertain Sillin and the rest. She was a typical woman from the commoner district, but it was obvious that she treated 20% very well, and her smile was very sincere. Her son held a rag in his hand and ran behind his mother with his short legs. "Do you want to go live in the city?" Sillin asked. "No, I'm not suitable." 20%, who already had a lot of deep wrinkles, scratched his head in embarrassment. "I still think I'm more suitable here. I'm not used to living in the city." "Come, Kong, call Uncle Sillin." 20% carried his son over. Sillin and 20% were of the same generation, so the child naturally should call Sillin Uncle. "Hello, Uncle Sillin." The child looked at Sillin and greeted. Actually, he felt that he should call Sillin Big Brother. The person in front of him looked so much younger than his father. However, he was more curious about the fat cat that was yawning on the table next to him. His eyes darted over. "So fat." "Hello, Kong. This is for you." Sillin took out the things that he had prepared from his bag. It was some snacks that he bought when he was buying cat food. Sometimes, Hui Mao would use these to grind his teeth. Sillin, this. 20% was embarrassed. Although he had never seen it before, he could tell that these things were very expensive. Moreover, they were all food that could not be bought in the surrounding area. The food did not attract much jealousy. The security in this area was not that good either. "It's okay. These are gifts for the little guy." Sillin pushed the things on the table towards Kong and rubbed his head. "Thank you, Uncle Sillin." Kong no longer paid attention to Hui Mao. After 20% agreed, the little guy sat obediently at the side with a pile of food. Hui Mao glared at the child who opened the packaging and started munching on the food. "That's what I use to grind my teeth when I'm bored." Seeing the fat cat on the table next to him waiting for him with its round eyes, Kong picked up a biscuit and handed it over. "Here, kitty." Hui Mao turned his head away. "Not eating. I'm angry." "Don't worry about it, Kong. Eat it yourself. It has its own cat food," said Sillin. 20%'s wife brought over a box of wine and a plate of snacks. She placed them on the table where Sillin and 20% were sitting. "Thank you, sister-in-law." Sillin took a bottle of wine. It was the taste of the old town. It was cheap, but it had enough flavor. It reminded Sillin of the days when he worked here. Cheto did not refuse the wine in front of him. Instead, he picked it up and took 2 sips. Hui Mao's eyes widened even more. "Why is a robot drinking wine?" It didn't take long for Hui Mao to notice some barely noticeable water vapor rising from Cheto's body. "Oh, sister-in-law, do you have tissues?" asked Silin. "Yes, please wait a moment." 20%'s wife smiled apologetically. Then she walked to the back room and passed some tissues to Silin. "Enjoy your meal. I'll go prepare some side dishes." 20%'s wife left after saying that. She called Kong along so that he wouldn't interrupt their conversation. She knew that Silin was the owner of this tavern, and that Silin was the one who gave 20% a better foothold. But was he here to take back the tavern? After Second Cheng's wife and little Kong had left, Silin gulped down a mouthful of wine and said to Second Cheng, "You and little Kong can increase your gene rank through genetic transformation. This way, your lifespan will naturally be a little longer. You have the highest success rate. Kong is slightly worse, but his success rate is still around 70 to 80%. 20% put down the bottle and asked, "Where's the kid's mother? She's a little special. I'm afraid her success rate is only 10% at most." Silin had already analyzed Kang's DNA when he was rubbing his son's head. When he took the tissue, Silin touched 20%'s wife's finger and analyzed her DNA as well. There were some things that even the most advanced medical technology couldn't change. Jinya once said that it was called fate. Then forget it. 20% smiled. "Thank you, Silin." 20% knew that Silin thinks that Silin is helping him, but he didn't force the issue. Silin took out a bottle and a box of liquid medicine. "This is for 5 people. You can try it if you change your mind." What Celine took out was a potion he had synthesized himself. It was milder and had fewer side effects. It was suitable for people with low geno ranks. No one in a hunter regiment would use this potion because their average geno rank was above B rank. 20%'s hands trembled as he looked at the bottle and medicine on the table. This was something they didn't even dare to think about. Silin took out another card. The rent from 20%'s deal had always been on this carry card. "I'll leave this pub to you," Silin said. "I've already done the paperwork." Actually, the paperwork was done directly by hacking into the system. It only saved the manual verification process. No one would be able to find out, and no one would. Old David took the opportunity to emigrate. No one knew where he went. On this planet, 20% was the only person that Silin knew. After leaving the pub, Silin went to Jinya's former residence. The lush and leafy Fuji tree in the courtyard looked a little sickly right now. The last time Silin came over, it hadn't grown much, and now it looked even sicker than before. Sure enough, without the people from the Jin family, the Fuji tree couldn't grow. Silin touched the cracked bark on the Fuji tree and said, "Hold on a little longer. I'll take you to the Jin family." Silin was standing quietly in the yard and reminiscing. Squatting on the broken, almost rotten wooden rocking chair under the Fuji tree, Hua Mao's eyes narrowed. Suddenly, his ears twitched, and he looked toward a certain direction in the yard. At the same time, Silin and Cheto also looked in that direction. In the next moment, a figure nimbly jumped over the wall, avoided the protective equipment on the wall, and landed steadily on the ground. It was a very arrogant landing posture. Then, the bearded man who was dressed like a normal civilian in this area was stunned when he looked up. It was obvious from his expression that he didn't notice that there was someone in the yard, and there wasn't just one. Even the fat cat sitting on the rotten wood was looking at him. His face twitched as he landed in an arrogant posture. However, the sense of vigilance he had when he found out that there was someone in the yard was greatly reduced when he saw the person in the yard and the fat cat who was looking at him, as if it had seen something fun. "Cough. Hee. I've entered the wrong yard. Goodbye." A rough male voice rang before he turned around and prepared to slip away. "Where are you going, Hoosie?" Silin's leisurely voice rang. The man who was about to jump over the wall almost twisted his waist. He turned around and looked at Silin helplessly. "You can recognize me like this?" Hui Mao yawned again, narrowed his eyes, and continued to sleep. He wasn't an enemy, so he couldn't fight. Boring. "What are you doing here? Sector X and Sector S are pretty far from each other," Silin said. The bearded man in front of him, who looked like the most common civilian in the ghetto, was the disciple of the current leader of Fire Phoenix, one of the 3 great forces of Sector S. Pianhua. You're always dressed like a man every time I run into you. Do you have transvestism? Silin said. Nonsense. This is called concealment, do you know? Pianhua did not elaborate. Silin had a feeling that there should be more to this than meets the eye. However, Pianhua was unwilling to talk about it, so Silin did not pursue the matter any further. He said, What are you doing here? Climbing over the wall? What about trespassing? Pianhua stopped pretending now and walked over with a swing of his arms. Nothing. I just saw that no one has been living here for a long time, so I was curious. Hui Mao's nose twitched. Don't you have a place to stay? You need to pay to stay here, and there are so many of you. Everyone has to pay their own rent. Pianhua's eyes flashed, and then he chuckled. No, it's just me. But Silin, what are you guys doing here? This is my birthplace. This yard belongs to my master, Silin said. Ah, so that's how it is. You were born here. Pianhua was flabbergasted. Although he did not know much about Silin, he knew that Silin was a powerful person. He could not imagine that Silin was born in such a small and broken place, and in the slums at that. So, you're just here to reminisce? Pianhua asked. Silin looked at Pianhua. What do you want to say? Nothing. Pianhua was a little hesitant. Sang Bote, Silin said softly. Hearing Silin's words, Pianhua suddenly raised his head. Seeing the expression in Silin's eyes, Pianhua did not plan to hide it anymore. Yes, I've been in contact with Sang Bote. Silin was originally just probing, but when Pianhua suddenly raised his head, he knew the information in one glance. So when Silin confirmed his guess, Pianhua also knew that he could not hide it anymore. You're really cunning. Pianhua sat next to the pile of rotten wood and flicked the cat on Hui Mao's ear with his finger. Hui Mao's flicking caused his finger to pop loudly. How did you come to be with Sang Bote? Silin asked. I met him along the way, so I gave him a hand along the way. Also, Sang Bo's popularity among the people is pretty high. Back when the prison was still around, I heard some people talk about him in prison. After I came out, I also learned some things, especially the people of Sector M. They all respect Sang Bote a lot. I also received a mission to protect Sang Bote until he is handed over to the people who will receive him. However, Sang Bote has not contacted me of his own accord, and I cannot find a specific location for now. Oh, I didn't think that the person Sang Bote was talking about was you. But if it is you, I can help persuade him. After all, Sang Bo's safety can be somewhat guaranteed with you around. The pursuers will soon find Sang Bote's location. They have a special tracker. Pianhua stood up and casually patted the dust on his pants. How is it? All right, I will wait at this location. If Sang Bote is willing to accept my help, you can take him there. Silin gave the address of the newly built yard to Pianhua. I didn't expect you to have a place to live. I don't want anyone else to come to this yard. Silin looked at the yard. All right, I apologize for jumping in without permission. Remembering the address, Pianhua turned around, took a few steps, and floated out. He looked very familiar with the process. I will go reinforce the surrounding protective wall system, Cheto said. Silin nodded and then looked at the Fuji tree that did not have many leaves and frowned. Hui Mao stretched his back and rubbed his claws out of habit. As a result, he scratched the already broken rotten wooden chair even more. What are you thinking about again, Silin? Hui Mao jumped onto Silin's shoulder and asked while secretly rubbing the rotten wood shavings on his claws on Silin's clothes. He also rubbed a small mushroom between his toes on Silin's collar. While the gray cat was grinning, Silin, who was staring at the Fuji tree leaves, raised a hand and pinched the hair at the back of the gray cat's neck. His other hand patted little mushroom on his shoulder and the back of his collar. I know you're up to no good the moment you hooked your tail. All right, I've modified the yard's protective system. There are too many loopholes, so it took a lot of time, Cheto said after walking out of the yard. If anyone else heard this, it would be strange if they didn't vomit blood in anger. It took less than 2 minutes, and you call it took a lot of time? If it were anyone else, it would probably take half a day. Looking at the almost bald and withered Fuji tree again, Silin grabbed Hui Mao, turned around, and walked towards the door. Let's go over there. Silin waited in the new courtyard all the way until nighttime. Pianhua finally brought Sang Boat over quietly. There are also 5 people following Sang Boat over. They were Sang Boat's bodyguards. One of the bodyguards was heavily injured, and the other two were lightly injured. Those who weren't injured also looked tired, including Sambert. Only Pianhua looked very energetic. Silin, I know you. You saved me once, Sambot said to Silin. If he didn't know that the person who came was Silin, Sambot wouldn't have agreed so quickly. As for the reason he came at night, it was to avoid some eyes and ears. I'm also very happy to see you again, Silin said. Chapter 397. I didn't expect you Linglong to find you. Sambot sighed. Silin smiled, but then Silin found that there was something wrong with Sambot's right hand hidden in his slender sleeve. Sensing Silin's gaze, Sambot raised his right arm and pulled up his sleeve, revealing his right arm that had been cut off. The wound had been treated, but it was only a rough treatment. It must have been quite painful. I was betrayed. They implanted a signal transmitter in my right hand. Sambot said. Sambot had been chased for some time. He also wondered why those people could always find him even though he was hiding so well. After checking several times, he didn't find anything special. Later, when he was in danger, he met Pianhua. Pianhua said the reason. Sambot's right hand was implanted with a special signal transmitter. Sambot liked the wristband communicator. Once, his wristband communicator broke, so he used a new one. He wore the communicator on his right hand, and since then, he had never taken it off. After Pianhua said the reason, Sambot knew that his communicator had been tampered with. Knowing the reason, Sambot wanted to take off the communicator, but found that it was useless. The transmitter had already seeped into his right hand. Therefore, Sambot decisively cut off his right hand and destroyed the communicator. One of the reasons why he didn't take the initiative to contact Silin and Silin couldn't contact Sambot was because the communicator was destroyed. However, Sambot didn't use the bodyguard's communicator. He had to be cautious now. Pianhua wasn't sure if there was only one signal transmitter. Maybe there were other, more hidden signal transmitters to let the pursuers know Sambot's specific location. Therefore, they didn't dare to stay in a place that was easily exposed. When Pianhua was looking for a hiding place, he took a fancy to the courtyard in the wilderness. He also observed that there seemed to be no one living there, so he wanted to take the courtyard and use it as a temporary hiding place. After taking the courtyard, Pianhua could use the courtyard's protective network to set up some simple shielding facilities. However, he didn't expect to bump into Silin and the others as soon as he jumped in. Don't you need to treat your injury? Silin asked. No, let's stay like this for now. We'll talk about it when it's safe in the future. We might not even be able to return safely. Sambert waved his hand and was supported by the bodyguards into a room arranged by Silin for them to rest. They were really tired, but no matter how tired they were, the bodyguards had to take turns to guard them. For Sambert's hand injury, Silin didn't take out those medicines. Sambot was now very guarded against people. Perhaps he wasn't like this in the past, but after knowing that he was betrayed by someone he trusted, his guard became even stronger. If Sambert could be trusted a little more, the wound on his hand wouldn't have been treated so roughly. Silin didn't believe that Pixahuo hadn't taken out healing equipment, so it must have been Sambert who refused. They didn't even trust Pianhua who had saved them, so they definitely wouldn't trust Silin who was entrusted by Yu Linglong to protect Sangbai. Aren't you going to rest? Silin asked Pianhua, who was playing with Hui Mao with a piece of dry grass. I'm not tired yet. I'll rest later. Pianhua plucked the dry grass from Hui Mao's paws and swept Hui Mao's nose. He seemed to be in good spirits. All right, Silin, does the 11th squad accept outsiders? Pianhua turned to Silin. You want to join? Yes. I'm quite envious of you hunters. You can go on adventures everywhere. Pianhua looked at the short piece of dried grass in his hand that was bitten by the gray cat. He threw it away and sat upright. I'm serious. If you can accept outsiders, I want to join you as an outsider. Nope, the 11th squad doesn't accept outsiders. Wheeze interrupted Silin before he could answer. It was as if Wheeze was the decision-maker. Pianhua looked at Silin again and saw that he was thinking the same thing. After a moment of thought, he asked, what if I join the 11th squad? That way, he wouldn't be considered an outsider anymore. Silin fell silent. Pianhua was backed by one of the three great forces of Sector S, Fire Phoenix. if Pianhua joined the 11th squad. Will your master agree? Silin didn't believe that Fire Phoenix would be so easy to talk to. Of course, my master has never objected to my decisions, Pianhua said confidently. Silin's curiosity was piqued. He had learned some information about Pianhua from CGU, and he knew that the current leader of Fire Phoenix valued Pianhua greatly. Pianhua's status in Fire Phoenix was very high, but the current Fire Phoenix didn't restrict him at all. When the prison was still around, Pianhua often visited the prison, and when the prison was no longer around, Pianhua left sector to roam freely. Moreover, the current Fire Phoenix didn't even assign a bodyguard to Pianhua. It was a little illogical. Regardless of whether Sector S was a special place or not, the other two forces besides Fire Phoenix, Golden Beginnings and Genia, protected Jin Xingfu and the others very well, and Flying Snake CGU also had a few protectors around him. It just so happened that Pianhua, whom the current Fire Phoenix valued quite a bit, was an exception. CGU was puzzled when he mentioned Pianhua. There was no doubt that Pianhua's status in Fire Phoenix was undeniable, but this person was just too weird. Could it be that Pianhua had disguised himself every time to avoid being recognized? If it was just a disguise, then the current Fire Phoenix shouldn't have allowed Pianhua to run around freely. Seeing that Silin didn't answer immediately, Pianhua turned around and looked at Hui Mao, who was licking his paws. He said seriously, "I can pay the admission fee. This amount," Pianhua said and gestured with his fingers. Hui Mao's eyes lit up in an instant, and he immediately looked at Silin. His meaning was for Silin to think about it carefully. Silin was speechless. Had this cat's weakness been exposed so quickly? "All right, I'll give you time to think about it. I'm not in a hurry. You can give me an answer after this incident is over." Pianhua dusted his hands and stood up to stretch his arms. He didn't return to his room to rest, but instead sat on a stone bench in the courtyard and stared at the sky. This courtyard was already shielded from satellite surveillance, so even if there was an explosion in this courtyard, the sky, I wouldn't react. "Hey, Silin, where has your 11th squad been? Recommend me some special places. If I can't join a hunter regiment, I want to go check them out myself," Pianhua said. "Special places?" Silin thinks for a moment, and then named a few places that hunters frequented, including their former hunting grounds. "That's great," Pianhua said. Silin didn't know if Pianhua was referring to the hunter profession or those places. Hui Mao's ears twitched as he listened to the conversation lazily. Silin didn't need Hui Mao's reminder to notice that someone was coming his way. He had installed some sensors within 500 meters of the courtyard, and someone had triggered them. The sensors didn't detect people, but metals. This way, the chances of being discovered would be reduced. The people in this area wouldn't carry precious metals with them. Weapons made from such metals were extremely expensive, and the people of the civilian district couldn't afford them at all. Moreover, the fact that someone was able to move so quickly while carrying such metals meant that they were no ordinary person. Cheto immediately notified Sambot while he was next door. As expected, the signal transmitter wasn't the only thing they relied on to track someone. A moth-like insect flew into the courtyard, and Silin stared at it for a moment. It looked very similar to a normal moth at first glance, but a closer look would reveal that there was a huge difference between the two. This wasn't a moth. There weren't many moths in this area, and they were considered a rare species. The most common species in this area were flies. Smell. The smell of blood on Sambit's injured right hand, and Sambit's own scent. These people were using these special moths to sense smell to track Sambot. They had made a few preparations. At first, they must have relied on the signal transmitter to track Sambot, but they also considered the possibility that the transmitter might be discovered and destroyed. Therefore, they used this kind of moth. Hui Mao jumped up and swallowed the moth that flew into the courtyard. He opened his mouth and swallowed it. "Disgusting," Hui Mao commented. "Why are you eating it even though it's disgusting?" Pianhua curled his lips at the side. Pianhua and Silin retreated to the small building. Cheto and Sambit's two bodyguards stood guard on the other side of the building. Almost silent bullets shot towards Silin and Pianhua, but they were all blocked by a transparent shield in front of them. This was Pianhua's setup. Pucci, An arrow of blood sprayed into the air from outside the wall. Then, there was the sound of a human body falling to the ground. This was Huimao's handiwork. Squatting next to the stone bench and being ignored, Huimao took advantage of the moment when the people were shooting at Silin and Pianhua. His claw almost broke the person's neck, and this was the result of Huimao holding back. It had been holding back for a long time, and it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. After discovering that their companions had been hit for some reason, the people immediately became vigilant of their surroundings. But in the next moment, 3 of them were shot in the head almost at the same time. Who fired the shot? This was the question on the remaining people's minds. The only person who pulled out a gun at the small building was Silin, but they clearly saw that Silin's gun wasn't pointed in their direction. Why were they shot? And 3 people were shot at the same time. This was just the beginning. 5 more people were shot in succession. They were still wondering before they died. They clearly avoided the muzzle, and they clearly weren't in the direction the muzzle was pointing at. So why were they shot? After finishing off these people, Silin turned around, and Pianhua also finished off 2 people. There was a hidden weapon on her arm. Normally, it looked like a normal arm guard, but it was a killing weapon right now. The hidden weapon shot out was very fast, and it had a certain degree of tracking function. After the hidden weapon hit the person, it exploded inside the person's body. Although it was a small explosion, the critical point was that the internal organs exploded and killed them very quickly. A product of Fire Phoenix's technology? Silin was puzzled. I remember you have a whip, Silin said. Pianhua didn't answer. She hadn't recovered from her nervous state just now. She looked around vigilantly. There are 13 people here, but there are only 11 corpses. She suspected that there were 2 more people hiding around. There's no need to look. They're all dead. The moment Silin finished speaking, the gray cat jumped over from the other side of the courtyard wall and curled its lips. It complained as it walked over, disgusting. Pianhua. On the other side of the building, Cheto had finished off 7 people, and the remaining 2 were taken care of by Sambat's subordinates. When Silin entered the house, Sambat and his subordinates looked at Silin and Cheto strangely. They didn't see Silin's performance, but 2 subordinates who were responsible for observing Silin's side did. Just a moment ago, they were still doubting Cheto and Cheto's capabilities, but before they could react, they saw Cheto pull out a gun and shoot at them. Not only that, he was also shooting at them at an extremely fast speed. His speed was so fast that they only realized how many people Cheto had killed when he dragged the dead pursuers inside. Sambat had witnessed the 11th Squad's combat power back at Sector M, and he was shocked once more today. From the moment they discovered the pursuers, to the moment they attacked, to the moment they finished off the entire wave of pursuers, it didn't take more than 3 minutes. Strictly speaking, the time it took to finish off the pursuers was less than a minute, excluding the time they spent waiting vigilantly. When Sambat's bodyguards thought back to every time they ran into a wave of pursuers, they fell silent. Is everyone in Vanguard the same as you? Sambat asked. Nope. Silin knew what Sambat meant, but if even a 5th, a 10th, or even a 100th of Vanguard's members had Cheto's combat power, the Big Four would have ceased to exist a long time ago. The only one left behind would be Vanguard, the absolute ruler of the high ground. I think so too. Sambat smiled himself. It was obvious that he had thought of the same logic. The pursuers this time were only the first wave. They were the Vanguard sent by Yu Linglong's second cousin brother, Yu Xing. There would definitely be more coming after them, but no one knew when they would arrive. However, I advise you to treat the wound on your hand first, and conceal your aura. Silin took out a small spray bottle. Everyone in the 11th Squad was very familiar with this kind of spray bottle because they used it often. Silin told Sambat about the moth from before and took out a moth. There were 2 tracking moths, and Huimao had eaten one of them. The other one was kept as evidence. Sambat didn't refuse this time, and Pianhua took out his medical equipment of his own accord for Sambat to use. However, Sambat's bodyguard didn't know how to use it, so Pianhua guided him from the side. No, you need to apply the medicine evenly. It can't be too thick. You need to apply another medicine later. Don't apply it too far away from the wound. Pianhua kept instructing the bodyguard on the correct application of the medicine. However, the bodyguard's hands weren't very dexterous, and he wasn't very proficient in this. In the past, when they were injured, they just had to do some simple treatment. After enduring it, they would go to the healing pod and lie down. The medical machinery would help them, so there was no need to do such complicated things. Although the treatment would definitely be much better, the process of applying medicine was really troublesome, and there were many details that needed to be paid attention to. The bodyguard who was more familiar with medicine was injured, so his movements wouldn't be very dexterous. He could only let this person who wasn't familiar with medicine help Sambot. After applying the first medicine, the bodyguard was already sweating profusely. He felt that this was much more difficult than dealing with the pursuers. Seeing this, Sambot waved his hand and looked at Pianhua. "I'll have to trouble you to help. They're too clumsy." "Okay, it'll be quick. I'm familiar with this, and now that it's done, it'll be much easier for you to go back and do the differentiation treatment." Pianhua picked up the second medicine and began to apply it skillfully. The bodyguard used 5 minutes to apply the first medicine, while Pianhua only used half a minute to apply the second medicine, and then continued with the other treatments. Judging from Pianhua's proficiency, it wasn't hard to imagine that this person had suffered many injuries before. Most of the time, it was these primitive medicines that saved people without any auxiliary machinery. Even the most advanced medical equipment couldn't replace these medicines, and this was something that hunters felt the most deeply. 5 minutes later, Sambot's hand looked much better than before after being treated anew. Sambot and his subordinates had also used the scent concealment spray Silin had given them before, so they should be able to avoid the tracking moths. It was just that they didn't know what other methods the pursuers might use to track them down. "This time, I have to thank you brats," Sambert said. "You brats?" Hui Mao tilted his head and looked at Pianhua. It was obvious that this person was a woman at first glance. This old man's eyesight was really bad. It wasn't that Sambot's eyesight was bad, but Pianhua's disguise was too good. After all, Sambot and his men weren't Hui Mao and Cheto. Sambot moved his newly treated arm and looked at Pianhua again. "I suddenly feel that you look a little like an old friend of mine." Just now, Silin noticed that Sambot's gaze towards Pianhua was a little strange. So this was the reason. However, Sambot's friend, Pianhua, who was tidying up the medicine bottles, paused for a moment when he heard Sambot's words. Then, he continued to tidy up and asked in a casual tone, "Your friend? Who is it?" "Sifong." Silin's eyelids twitched. "See?" Very quickly, Silin's attention moved from this surname to this name. He had seen this name before when he went as Sector S with Lung in some of the information Lung had given him. This person wasn't mentioned in the military information the League of Stars government had made public. And the reason why Celine was able to pay special attention to this person was mainly because he was Grandfather Mo's son. Because before Grandfather Mo's son Mo Qing, the person who sat in his position was Sifong. After Sifong, Mo Qing then took over Sifong's position. Sifong was a famous general of the empire back then. She was also the only woman among the most influential generals. Later on, due to certain matters, Sifong was sent to Sector S's highest prison, and there was no news of her after that. At the time, Silin didn't pay attention to the information of a lot of military higher-ups who were sent to the highest prison. But now, looking at Pianhua, who was playing with a medicine bottle with her head lowered, Silin felt a little suspicious. Chapter 398. It wasn't that Silin was overly sensitive, but when he connected this surname to Sector S's highest prison, and then combined it with some of the information Silin knew before, the suspicions were too great. He had no choice but to ponder deeply. "I thought your eyes looked a lot like hers before, and they looked even more so when you were applying the medicine." Sambot looked at Pianhua as if he was looking at another person through Pianhua. However, Sambot immediately said regretfully, "It's a pity she didn't leave behind any descendants." Pianhua had disguised her appearance, but her eyes were unmodified. It was not easy to deny an old politician's intuition. Perhaps it was because he was betrayed by someone he trusted before that Sambot's trust in his intuition wasn't that strong. But after experiencing an assassination and nursing his wounds, that sense of trust was once again strong, and the strengthening of this sense of trust was based on an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Although Sambot felt that the person in front of him couldn't possibly be the descendant of that old friend, he still suspected that they could be blood relatives or something. Pianhua put away the medicine bottle with a shake of her hand and sat on a chair with her legs crossed. There are many people in the League of Stars who look alike, and there are many who look exactly the same. Sillin originally wanted to stay and listen to Sambot and Pianhua's conversation, but the communicator in his hand reacted. "I'm going to rest first. You guys take your time." Then Sillin walked to the lounge arranged for him on the second floor. Hui Mao followed Sillin upstairs, and Cheto left with Hui Mao instead of interrupting Sambot and Pianhua's conversation. However, with their ability, they could hear the content of their conversation even if they weren't there, unless Sambot and the others used a sound barrier. When Sillin arrived at the room, he turned on the communicator. "Where have you been this time?" Hidden Wuxia said helplessly on the projection. "What? You need something?" Sillin was curious as to why Hidden Wuxia contacted him so soon. It hadn't been long since they last met. "I say, why can't you just sit still? Where are you right now?" "I accepted a mission." Sillin didn't tell him about it. "Accepted a mission? Why are you being so mysterious?" Wuxia shot Sillin a strange look. "Never mind. It must be something between the 3 sectors. Your 2 hunter regiments have just finished their battle, so it can't be something between the hunter regiments. Plus, even if it's a secret mission for Vanguard, G-Phone wouldn't give it to you." Wuxia was right. Sillin did not deny it. "What is it?" Sillin asked again. Kane Wuxia stretched out 2 fingers. "There are 2 things I want to tell you. Firstly, I think the Big Four is about to be reshuffled. There might be a huge change in the near future. Great change. Yes. Secondly, keep an eye out for the time being. Those lunatics from Miracle will probably do something." "People from Miracle?" Sillin thinks for a moment and pointed upwards with 3 fingers. "What happened over there?" "It's mainly the military. The struggle between the military is getting more and more intense, and the final conflict might point towards Miracle. Once Miracle gives up, those lunatics from Miracle will do anything." Sillin frowned. Everything really came together as of late. "All right, that's all. Continue with your mission." "Wait." Sillin stopped Wuxia, who was about to disconnect. "What's your problem?" "Let me say this first. We're not going to get involved in those things right now." Wuxia tried to clear his name. "It's not that. I just want to ask you for some information." "Oh, what information?" "Do you know Si Fong?" Sillin said. Kane Wuxia, who was scooping an ice cream into his mouth, bit the spoon in half. "Why are you asking about her all of a sudden?" Instead of answering Wuxia's question, Sillin asked again, "Then do you know Pianhua?" Kane Wuxia pulled out the half-eaten spoon from his mouth and tossed it to the side. He said seriously, "You didn't rape her, did you?" Sillin, "It's fine, it's fine." Seeing Sillin's speechless expression, Wuxia chuckled. "It seems you've guessed something. I remember that both Pianhua and I were at the passageway back at Sector S's Grade 1 prison. Why did you drag me in and not Pianhua?" "Ahem, I didn't know about your relationship with that cat at that time. Otherwise, I wouldn't have left you there at that time," Wuxia thought. At the time, Wuxia did not kill Sillin directly for Pianhua's sake, and Sillin became Wuxia's lackey during the battle against the fog. After that, he didn't pay much attention to the wounded and half-dead Sillin. After hypnotizing Sillin, he left Sillin alone. However, it was also at that time that Ice Cream discovered Hui Mao's existence. However, Hui Mao was so busy looking for Sillin that he didn't pay attention to his own kind at all. At the time, Wuxia didn't know that Hui Mao was with Sillin. "That's why I said you know Pianhua." Sillin said affirmatively. "All right, since you want to know, I'll tell you." Kane Wuxia spread his hands. It didn't matter to him anyway. The Si Fong you speak of is Si Huang's sister, his biological sister. Pianhua is Si Fong's daughter. She gave birth to him in Sector S's highest prison. Si Fong passed away not long after she gave birth to Pianhua. At the time, Ho Si Fong was old in the eyes of a normal person. However, due to her gene rank, her natural lifespan was much longer than a normal person's. Therefore, she wasn't considered old to people like them. Si Huang was a powerful person, so Si Fong, who was related to him by blood, couldn't be much weaker. Even the highest prison, Si Fong shouldn't have died from giving birth. Perhaps he saw Silen's confusion. Wuxia continued. The prison Si Fong was in had a fire not long after she gave birth to Pianhua. 70% of the prisoners in the prison died in the fire. But how could a heavily guarded prison have a fire? How could a normal fire burn down a heavily guarded prison? Kane Wuxia took out an image. This is the scene I took back then. Silen stared at the image on the projection. The prison was burned to ruins. The reinforced metal walls had all melted, and the ground was covered in a layer of condensed alloy. How high must the temperature of the flames be to melt these special alloy walls into this state? If even metal could be burned to this state, then the people who didn't come out of the prison couldn't. It was premeditated. That was for sure. However, even if it was premeditated, it was still buried in history. Not even the official information had any explanation about the incident. After so many years, probably only a few people who knew the secret behind it would remember it. Do you know why Si Fong was stripped of his military rank and sent to the highest prison? Kane Wuxia rubbed his fingers. It's because Si Fong slaughtered an entire planet and blew it up. That planet was the most important research base of Miracle at that time. There were too many people involved in Miracle. Si Fong slaughtered the most important planet and destroyed their interests. Many people from both the military and the government would definitely be furious. It was no wonder that Si Fong was stripped of his military rank and sent to prison. Slaughtering a planet's people wasn't a big deal for people of that level, but it wasn't a small deal either. The key was the reason. This reason could kill you, but it could also save you. Obviously, in the end, some people from both the military and the government found a reason that was enough to send Si Fong and some of his subordinates to prison. Then Si Huang. Silen thinks this was the key person. Si Huang and Si Fong had different ideologies. They had their own paths to decide, and neither side interfered with the other. When Si Fong was sent to prison, Si Huang also wanted to intervene, but Si Fong refused. In a fit of anger, Si Huang ignored her. A few months later, when the prison caught fire, Si Huang was with Azrael for some matters, so he didn't intervene. After that, Si Huang fell into a deep sleep due to his own reasons, so he didn't let Azrael get involved. When he woke up, the first thing he did was kill Orlas. Orlas was one of the 4 Heavenly Edict warriors, and also the one Long told Silen had killed by Si Huang. At the time, Silen was wondering why Si Huang wanted to kill that Heavenly Edict warrior. Now, it seemed that it was for Si Fong, and Orlas must have had something to do with the fire. Back then, Orlas was very angry because of what happened on that planet Miracle. However, Si Fong's military achievements were still there, so he couldn't openly execute him, so he could only resort to underhanded methods. In Unpardonable said, as if he was taking pleasure in Si Fong's misfortune. Is Si Huang really that powerful? Silen asked. After all, apart from their own abilities, Heavenly Edict warriors would definitely have a lot of people around them. How could it be that easy to kill Orlas, one of the Heavenly Edict warriors? You've really hit the nail on the head. Si Huang wouldn't have been able to do it so smoothly by himself, unless he got all the people in Azrael to participate. However, before Si Huang could gather all the people in Azrael, a perfect opportunity presented itself. The person who provided this opportunity was Wei Ting. Wei Ting was also one of the 4 current Heavenly Edict warriors. Other than the Yu family, the Ci family, and Orlas, it was Wei Ting. At the time, Silen was wondering why Wei Ting, a Heavenly Edict warrior, had become so well-behaved after Orlas's death. He didn't think that Wei Ting had actually schemed against Orlas a long time ago, and was just pretending to be well-behaved. Si Fong was one of Wei Ting's generals back then, his most capable assistant, and also the highest-ranking general among those who were punished. If Si Fong hadn't been punished back then, the situation in the army might not be like this. After Si Fong was punished, some of Si Fong's subordinates left Wei Ting and defected to others. I bet they were very disappointed in Wei Ting. It was also at that time that Wei Ting's power was far inferior to the other 3. In my opinion, Wei Ting deserved it. He didn't even dare to admit his own woman and couldn't protect her. How could he still have the face to be a Heavenly Edict warrior? Silen, I think I've guessed something. It's exactly what you think. That's why I've always felt that those guys were extremely hypocritical. Don't be fooled by how those ordinary people praise the heavenly edict warriors like they're gods. After all, they're just humans, not mythical gods. They have a lot of shortcomings, and they have a bad temper. Wei Ting had his own family, and it was normal for people of their status to have a few old lovers. But he didn't admit Si Fong. Oh, speaking of this, I have a message for you. Wuxia suddenly remembered and said, back then, Si Fong didn't hesitate to massacre that planet and then destroy it. It was actually because of this. And when I said that I wanted you to pay attention to those lunatics from Miracle, it was also because of this. Although Si Fong destroyed that planet back then, some of the information was preserved in some of Miracle's branches. After so many years of restoration, it should have recovered to the speed of what it was back then. A large part of the reason why the CI family has been suppressing Miracle is because of this. Sillin looked at the message in his hand. He suddenly understood why Si Fong did what he did back then. This kind of thing, once leaked, was even more dangerous than Zebra. That's why I said that you have to be careful. Your life is the most important thing. If the CI family can't do anything about it, then the others don't have to waste their energy. Wuxia wasn't a compassionate person. Even if almost all the people in the League of Stars were dead, he wouldn't feel much. However, he really cared about the cat in Sillin's hand. If something happened to Sillin, that cat wouldn't have it easy. If that cat didn't have it easy, then no one would play with Little Ice Cream. After talking with Wuxia, Sillin looked at the information Wuxia gave to Sillin. This information was incomplete, and it was already very good that Wuxia's people were able to obtain this information. If he wanted to further understand this kind of thing, he still needed to collect more information. While Sillin was deep in thought, Hui Mao poked his head in through the door. Seeing Sillin's serious expression, he twitched his ears and jogged over to Sillin's shoulder. He patted Sillin's face with his paw. Were you talking to Wuxia just now? Although Hui Mao couldn't monitor the content of Sillin and Wuxia's conversation like he could with other communications, Hui Mao could still know who was talking to. Yes, it was him. Then did you ask him for money? He's still in debt. That bastard. Hui Mao said angrily. It's eating and dashing. Same thing. In any case, that old man and that stinky rat didn't pay. Sillin pulled Hui Mao off his shoulder and stroked his fur. The information he provided is quite valuable. It's worth a few bastard meals for you. Hui Mao shook his beard and thought for a while before saying, that's more like it. But if they still dare to eat bastard meals next time, I'll beat them to death. Yes, next time I'll beat them to death. Sillin scratched Hui Mao's chin. How's the eavesdropping going? Hui Mao pulled his ears to the side, looking very disappointed. It's not useful. Sillin thinks the same. However, looking at Sambot, his relationship with Si Fong back then should have been quite good. Moreover, Sambot was one of the few people who thought for the people of the League of Stars. No matter how sincere he was, it was still a good thing. What were you thinking about just now? Hui Mao asked while licking his paw. I was thinking about all the trouble ahead. What's there to think about? If we can't stay in the League of Stars, we could go to Mist Bodhisattva. Mist Bodhisattva has my territory too. Even if we can't survive there, we can still try to explore other galaxies. Mist Bodhisattva and the League of Stars aren't the only places in the universe. With Moon and the others' technology, we don't have to worry about not having a place to stay. Hui Mao was an open-minded guy. He only cared about a few people anyway. He didn't care about the others. I also want to explore the universe to my heart's content, but it's not easy to do. You humans are so complicated. I think so too. That's why it's so hard to create original robots. Sillin sat on the chair and thought for the whole night. Hui Mao slept on Sillin's lap the whole night. His sleeping posture wasn't good, and he would start kicking his legs and paw every time he fell asleep. Sillin guessed that he was fighting with ice cream even in his dreams. Other than the assassination attempt at the beginning, no one else had come for the night yet. After a night's rest, Sambit's spirit was much better. His backup hadn't arrived yet, so he stayed here for the time being. Sillin had brought enough food with him, so they didn't need to go out to buy it. Therefore, the group stayed in the courtyard to avoid being seen by others. Although there weren't many people around, it was easy to pay attention to unfamiliar faces. The stone bench in the courtyard was occupied by Hui Mao and Pianhua, so Silin sat on the ground. The ground was covered in weeds. It didn't look good, but it was full of vitality. Silin sat on the grass and started writing and drawing on an electronic tablet. It was all code, and only Silin knew what the code represented. Even if others saw it, they wouldn't know what it meant. After squatting on the stone bench for a while, Hui Mao jumped onto the grass and rolled a few times. He rolled directly to Silin's side and climbed onto Silin's lap. He changed into a comfortable position and began to sleep with his eyes closed. Silin ignored the grass that Hui Mao rubbed on his leg and continued to work on the work at hand. Pianhua held her chin and looked at the pair. If this cat ignored the previous incident of eating people, it was really a cute pet cat. The afternoon sun was very good. Pianhua looked at it and also felt a little sleepy. She didn't sleep well last night, not because of the assassination, but because of the people that Sambot mentioned and made her think a lot. Now that she had recovered, especially when she saw the cat sleeping comfortably, Pianhua's sleepiness came. He looked at the sunlight in the sky and then around the yard. There weren't any wooden benches, hammocks, or anything like that. His gaze swept across the gray cat on Silin's lap once before he walked over to it out of curiosity. He didn't even look at what Silin was writing, and he simply moved the gray cat sleeping across Silin's lap. Hui Mao lazily raised his head and looked at Pianhua. Then he narrowed his eyes and fell back to sleep. No matter how Pianhua tossed him, he didn't care. After making Hui Mao into a circle, Pianhua also sat on the ground and rested his head on Hui Mao's body. The pure natural plush pillow was soft. Silin's movements paused. He looked down at Hui Mao, who was nestled on his lap, and then looked at Pianhua, who was using Hui Mao as a pillow. His legs had to bear the weight of a fat cat and a human head. He couldn't move much. If he moved, the man and the cat would start smacking their lips. Not only could he not move his legs under the weight, but Silin looked at the saliva mixed with fish biscuit crumbs flowing out of Hui Mao's mouth and onto his trousers. There was also the same suspicious liquid flowing out of someone's mouth. Silin's forehead twitched again and again. These two guys. Chapter 399. When Sambot came out to stretch his old bones, he had a strange expression on his face when he saw the group in the courtyard. It would have been fine if the person sleeping on Hui Mao was a graceful girl, but it just had to be a bearded man. Sambot found it strange no matter how he looked at it. When he was chatting with Pianhua last night, he even suggested that she shave off her beard so that she would look more energetic. In the end, Pianhua didn't listen to him and used other words to fool him. In fact, Pianhua thought to herself at the time, "Are you kidding me? It took me a lot of effort to decorate myself. How can I shave it just like that?" A beard was the best way to hide one's appearance and change one's temperament. Moreover, makeup was simple and convenient. At least that was what she thought. That was why Pianhua would always add a bit of beard whenever she changed clothes. "My lord, that person isn't here." While Sambot was looking at the strange group in the courtyard, one of his subordinates came over and whispered. The person he mentioned was actually Cheto. Sambot trusted Pianhua more than he trusted Silin. After all, Silin was brought here by Yuling Long, and Sambot had to be careful when it came to anything related to the Yu family. It was inevitable that he would be more vigilant. Even if Silin had saved his life before, Sambot couldn't be at ease. Moreover, after witnessing Cheto's abilities, Sambot paid a lot of attention to him. Silin said that only he and Cheto had come here, but Silin was here and Cheto was nowhere to be seen. Why would they go out when there was food and other things here? Sambot nodded slightly to show that he understood. Sambot's subordinates recovered very quickly after treatment. Those who worked in this line of work had to have a much stronger physique. Being able to act as Sambot's bodyguards not only earned them deep trust, but their abilities were also guaranteed. The Cheto they spoke of was indeed not in the courtyard. Cheto was collecting information around the civilian area and strengthening the defense network. This way, the signals they detected would be able to filter out the original residents here and screen out the suspicious ones. They couldn't just wait here and do nothing. Cheto was walking in stealth mode. This way, he could observe the people in this area without being discovered. It was as if he was a bystander looking at the true face of this area. Sillin told him that this place had changed a little too much, and that the population used to be a lot bigger than it used to be. Cheto had copied some of the information and records of this area, and he was able to understand the situation back then. Even he himself found it hard to imagine that Sillin was born in a place like this. Week to week, the people around him, regardless of physique or natural lifespan, were too short. Cheto had heard from Sha Ro and Shur Tang that they lived in the civilian district as well, but the gap between them was too big. The average constitution of the commoners in the Mist Bodhisattva Empire was several times, if not dozens of times stronger. Cheto only needed to do a cursory scan to know the genetic condition of most people in this area. No wonder they had no choice but to live in this place. Cheto saw a lot of people with serious genetic defects, and most of them were children. There were no adults among them because they couldn't grow to adulthood safely. Not even the best genetic medicines had much of a chance to change them. However, these children didn't seem to feel their own sorrow or the death of this area at all. They chatted and played with the adults and their friends. They were too young to understand. Or maybe they didn't even realize that they were one of those who were sad. Or maybe they had grown up too early and gotten over it. Cheto checked the radiation level, heavy metal, and poisonous pollution around the area. It had exceeded the resistance range of the children with the lowest genetic quality. If this continued, it would only accelerate the death of these children. There were basically no fish or prawns in the river. When the planetary government built an artificial river, they raised a group of aquatic creatures. However, these creatures didn't survive for long. While fishing was one reason, the other reason was that the productivity of these aquatic creatures was so low that they were destroyed by various factors before they could adapt to the environment. The reason Sillin bought a house here wasn't because he wanted to build a huge territory. Instead, he wanted to build a huge underground radiation protection network and a heavy metal filter. This network wouldn't be detected by the sky. It wouldn't be detected by the people in this area, but at least the people with the lowest genes would be able to stay in this world for a while longer. They wouldn't wither before they grew up like Hannah did back then. Suddenly, Cheto looked at a certain place. That place belonged to Sillin's planning area, and there were some sensing facilities there as well. Just now, Cheto had sensed an abnormal signal coming from that direction. 10 people? This was probably the second group of pursuers after yesterday. Cheto ran towards that direction. Sillin had bought the place yesterday, and there were only a few abandoned houses around. Many shadows passed through the abandoned houses so quickly that normal people couldn't see them. Suddenly, the person running at the very front stopped on a half-collapsed wall. Behind him, the other 9 people stopped one after another, and each of them stood in different places, forming a formation. The leader was wearing a mask so that his face couldn't be seen. He could see many things invisible to the naked eye through the mask, such as the invisible Cheto, who was walking towards him step by step. The other 9 people were wearing the same equipment, so of course they could see Cheto too. However, the image they saw wasn't clear. They could only see a rough outline, and not Cheto's actual appearance. "Who are you?" the leader asked in a hoarse voice. It was impossible to tell his age from his voice. These people knew that there couldn't be such a powerful person who could hide in front of them in this civilian district, and the information of Sambert's bodyguards didn't show such a person either. So, this person was sent by Yuling Long? Cheto didn't say anything. A series of shots answered them. There were no people from Sambert here, so Cheto didn't need to pretend anymore. His shots were almost silent, and they were very fast. Cheto moved very fast while shooting, so even if these people could see his figure through the mask, they might not be able to keep up with his speed. 7 seconds later, Cheto stopped moving and slowly revealed himself. There was an opening at the tip of each of his fingers, and it was the source of the bullets he shot out. There was no need for him to use a gun at all. He himself was an excellent weapon. However, the bullets he shot this time were a little different. Cheto had added some neural network to them. After taking care of the pursuers yesterday, Sillin told Cheto about the armed guard Pianhua was wearing. Cheto had modified it after listening to him. Pianhua's armed guard was probably given to her by Si Huang. It had a high firing speed and a tracking function, and Cheto was very suitable for this kind of weapon. The bullets Cheto fired from his fingertips were a part of himself, and they could track their target under his control. Their firing speed might not be as fast as Silen's Purgatory Thunder Snake, but even if they were blocked once, Cheto could still control them to track their target after they hit the ground. Unless the mechanical nerves inside the bullet were destroyed and the connection was severed, or if the bullet was beyond a certain range and Cheto couldn't control it anymore, the bullet would continue to track its target until it successfully caught up to its target. This group of 10 didn't expect to run into an opponent like this. Some of them didn't manage to dodge the bullets, and those who didn't expect the bullets to fly at them again in the next moment. Cheto's own speed was taken into account, so the entire conflict took less than 10 seconds. Cheto was pretty satisfied with the result after looking at the 10 people who had died. He waved his hand, and the bullets returned to Cheto's hand and merged back into his body. After taking care of the corpses, Cheto continued to collect information. Over at the courtyard, Silen was aware of the signal when the protective network set up there emitted it. Even the sleeping Huemao's ears twitched. When Cheto was dealing with the 10 people, Wheeze's head shot up and its eyes were as wide as saucers. His first thought, Cheto has gotten stronger again. His second thought, meow my shiny fur. Pienhua's saliva touched Huemao's fur a little. After Huemao woke up, he raised his front paw and slapped Pienhua. Then, the man and the cat began to quarrel, push, yell, and scratch as they entered the building from Silen's side. After entering Pienhua's room, the man and the cat stopped at the same time. Silen won't be angry, right? Piping Hua poked the gray cat beside him, who was deep in thought. I don't think so. Huimao remembered that he had eaten a lot of fish biscuits before he went to sleep. Just now, he saw some suspicious debris and the smell of fish biscuits, and dried fish on Silen's pants other than the saliva marks. After Pienhua and Huimao ran into the building, Silen looked at the 2 large saliva marks on his pants, and then at the man and cat who had been hiding inside for a long time. He patted the grass and half-dried food on his pants. These 2 fellows escaped really quickly. Sambot and the others didn't know that Cheto had taken care of the second group of pursuers outside. Even Pienhua couldn't tell if Silen knew or not. After all, she had something from Si Huang. Cheto returned at night. Some of the necessary arrangements had been completed, and some of the planned projects could be completed tomorrow. Huimao was in charge of digging the land. For the next 2 days, Sangbai was puzzled as to why there were no more pursuers. He had also suspected Celine until Pienhua told him that Celine and the others had secretly taken care of 2 groups of pursuers. Only then did Sangbai understand. After Cheto took care of the 10 pursuers, another group came over and was taken care of by both Huimao and Cheto. Silen stayed in Sambit's courtyard all this time while Cheto and Huimao went to finish the underground project. On the 5th day, Yu Linglong contacted Silen and told him that the reinforcements had arrived. After verifying each other's identities, Silen brought Sambot to the place where the reinforcements had landed. There was an invisible space plane parked there. Silen didn't know the reinforcements, but Sambot did. Sambot conversed with the person, and it seemed that their relationship was pretty good. Yu Linglong was also considerate. Is our mission complete, Silen? Huimao patted Silen's shoulder. Yes. Yu Linglong only told Silen to hand Sambot over to the reinforcements and that the mission was over. The person talking to Sambot glanced at Silen and waved his hand. The 2 people inside the space plane carried out 3 big boxes one after another. Inside the boxes were the rewards for this mission. The boxes were filled with rare metals, and any one of them could be sold for a good price. Wheeze curled its tail in satisfaction when it saw the 3 boxes. It naturally began to value these metals. After subtracting their expenses for this trip, subtracting Silen's enormous underground defense network, and subtracting Lord Cat's own hard work, there was still a lot of money left. It was enough to buy a lot of fish biscuits. Celine, thank you for this time. Sambot thanked Silen sincerely before he left. Although he wasn't satisfied with the Yu family, Sambot knew that if he and his subordinates hadn't run into Silen, they wouldn't have had it so easy. You're welcome. It's just a mission. Sambot paused and asked, do you agree with the Yu family's point of view? I don't know what the Yu family's point of view is or what position they stand on. I'm just a hunter. Silin looked at Sambot. You've done very well. Compared to a lot of people, Sambot had done very well in his position. This was Silin's affirmation of Sambot. Sambot smiled and didn't say anything else. He walked into the space plane with his subordinates. Before he entered the space plane, Sambot glanced at Pianhua again and sighed regretfully. The space plane rose into the air and quickly disappeared from sight. It was far away from this planet. Silin, where are you going next? Pianhua followed behind Silin and asked. Sector S, Pianhua. Originally, Pianhua was planning to follow Silin and see how a hunter's squad hunted, but Silin's next destination was her hometown, Sector S. She didn't have much freedom after entering Sector S. After all, the three forces that controlled Sector S right now were all acquaintances. Are you going to find Flying Snake or Jin Xingfu? Pianhua asked. I'm going to find the queen. Silin's answer puzzled Pianhua a lot. Ingenia, the queen of Sector S, had always treated everyone coldly. But as far as she knew, Ingenia treated Silin exceptionally well, even better than she treated Jin Xingfu and the others. Moreover, not long after Silin's squad left for Golden Beginning, the usually depressed and dispirited Yuan Xingfu became a lot more cheerful. He was no longer as gloomy as he used to be, and although he still looked sickly, it was a huge change compared to before. After thinking about it, Pianhua decided to return with Silin and the others. It was about time they returned. However, they had to be prepared to be scolded by their master again. Every time they went out, Pianhua couldn't avoid a scolding when she returned. Every time she was scolded, Pianhua would continue to go out as usual, and the current Fire Phoenix didn't stop her either. Before they left, Silin went to the yard where Jinya used to live and stuck the curly leaf pattern on his finger onto the almost bald Fuji tree. In the next moment, the tree entered the ring. The place where the Fuji tree used to be was sunken. There was no longer a Fuji tree here. Are we still coming here in the future? Huimao asked. Of course, Silin answered. When? I don't know. It could be a few years or a few decades. No matter how long it would be, they would still come and visit. Pianhua didn't board the same space plane as Silin and the others. She had her own space plane, and Sambot and the others were the ones who had come here earlier. Silin didn't call the 11th squad, because this was a private matter. It was fine if he led the squad to the place last time, but there was no need to call the 11th squad this time. They had their own plans. Just like Wuxia said, the vanguard after the battle had grown even more nervous than before. It was a vague sign that another storm was about to arrive, a storm that would reshuffle all the cards. It didn't matter if it was the conflict in the hunter world, the conflict in the military, or the contest between the politicians. None of these things could affect Sector S. The former prison was the reason Sector S was immune to the first three invasions. After the collapse of the almost independent prison system, it was scattered and infiltrated into the forces and organizations of Sector S. Now, it was guarded by the three great forces together. It was extremely difficult for any outside force to interfere. There might be a lot of people who looked down on the ragtag army of Sector S, but if the people who were once in prison were taken into consideration, then this ragtag army couldn't be underestimated. There were killers, abandoned hunters, defeated politicians, and former generals in the military. After the prison was removed, these people were integrated into what people thought was a motley crew. Sector S's security was relatively tight, but Silin had publicized his identity verification information and emphasized that the space plane belonged to Golden beginning the moment he entered Sector S. Of course, he wouldn't reveal his personal information. Silin had the pass Ingenia gave him, and the three great forces patrolling Sector S didn't try to stop Silin. Therefore, Silin's journey into Sector S had been smooth. However, before Silin could head to Golden Beginning's headquarters, a patrol team from Fire Phoenix intercepted them. To be more precise, the patrol team's target was Pianhua. However, since Silin's spaceplane and Pianhua's spaceplane were flying together, they were stopped at the same time. The other party didn't mean any harm, and they greeted Silin politely when they intercepted them. According to Pianhua's reaction, the interloper was very familiar with her. and they invited Silin to join them. These people wouldn't attack Silin and his group. From the conversation Hui Mao eavesdropped, it was obvious that the interloper just wanted to entertain Pianhua's friends, Silin and his group. Got it, Cheto said. Before entering the patrol ship, Cheto found out the interloper's identity and former identity based on the name and image mapping Hui Mao overheard. Silin had obtained some military information from Wuxia, but it was information from more than a decade ago. Even Wuxia might not be able to get his hands on the latest detailed information. Cheto was the one who found the interloper's identity through this information. Ran Zai, former colonel of the League of Stars Army, subordinate to General Si Fong. Cheto projected all the information he could find. It wasn't detailed, but it was enough to get a general idea of the interloper's former identity. Ran Zai was one of the people who was demoted and imprisoned along with General Si Fong during the incident. However, he wasn't imprisoned in the highest level prison. The lowest military rank in the highest level prison was originally a major general, and Ran Zai wasn't qualified back then. However, it was exactly because of this that Ran Zai didn't die in a sea of fire with the people in the highest level prison. He joined Fire Phoenix after the prison was abolished. Chapter 400. This was an opportunity. If he was one of Si Fong's former subordinates, he would definitely know about that incident. The patrol ship's hatch was already open, and its indicator lights were flashing. Silin piloted the space plane and followed Pianhua into the patrol ship. Just after he got off the space plane, Silin heard a burst of heroic laughter before he could even stand firm. Pianhua, you're finally back. Following the voice, Silin looked over and saw a middle-aged man wearing a Fire Phoenix combat uniform walking over. The newcomer was Ran Zai. Compared to 20 years ago when he was in the prime of his youth, one could still vaguely see his original angular face when he was young, but his tall and sturdy body, after more than 20 years, did not have the slightest crooked. He was still straight, his eyes were bright, and when he looked at Pianhua, he had the loving smile of an elder. Uncle Ran, I missed you so much. Pianhua jumped over and gave Ran Zai a hug. You little brat. Ran Zai tugged at the fake beard on Pianhua's face. You look more daring than last time. Of course. Pianhua was very satisfied with his disguise this time. Ran Zai was already used to Pianhua's disguise. After looking at Pianhua for a moment, his gaze moved to Silin. Silin, is it? I received a message from the Queen just now. She knew you had entered Sector S the moment you entered, and was about to send someone to welcome you. She knew I was here, so she asked me to keep you here. Someone will come to pick you up soon. For the sake of Pianhua and Angenia, Ran Zai was still very polite to Silin. At the very least, the smile on his face wasn't fake. Ran Zai's gaze swept past Silin before landing on Cheto. He paused for a moment, and then moved away with a smile. Then, he led Pianhua and Silin into the patrol ship. Ran Zai wasn't very curious about Silin. After all, he didn't know much about Silin. He only knew that Silin was a member of Vanguard, and was familiar with Golden Beginning's queen, Angenia. However, when Ran Zai looked at Cheto just now, he had a very strange feeling. He felt that this person was very special, and he couldn't see through him. As for the cat on Silin's shoulder, it was completely ignored. After that, Ran arranged a room for Silin and Cheto to rest and entertain them a little. Then, she went to chat with Pianhua. After eating and drinking to his heart's content, Hui Mao lay down on the soft bed and curled himself into a ball to sleep. Since he had to wait for the people from Golden Beginning to pick him up, he didn't have to worry about eating and drinking. There was a saying that went, "Sleep when you're full." This was a famous saying that Hui Mao had always believed in. Silin sat on a chair in the room and continued to write and draw with the electronic tablet in his hand. He was studying the information about the miracle that Yin Wuxia had given him, but he was afraid that he wouldn't make much progress even if he continued to study it. The doorbell rang while Silin was writing. It was Ran Zai. After he was done chatting with Pianhua, he came to check on Silin. After all, Silin was a guest, and an important guest of Angenia at that. It was not good to neglect him. Moreover, when Ran Zai and Pianhua were chatting just now, Pianhua's evaluation of Silin was very high as well. Ran Zai's attitude towards Silin had improved a lot. Are you used to this place? Can't sleep? Ranzai glanced at the fat cat who was sleeping comfortably on the bed and asked Sillin. Logically speaking, after driving for a long time, the cat should have fallen asleep very quickly after relaxing. He didn't look at what Sillin was writing on the tablet. Ranzai had always respected privacy. No, the arrangements here are very good. There are just some things I can't figure out. Sillin stopped writing and answered. Oh, what can't you figure out? Ranzai was very curious. Young people like Sillin were at the age where they were full of ambition. Ranzai felt that Sillin should have some common problems that young people of his age would have, so he was prepared to talk to him. However, Sillin's next action made the smile on Ranzai's face freeze. Sillin drew something on the tablet in his hand, then turned the tablet to face Ranzai. Looking at what Sillin was drawing on the tablet, Ranzai's expression became serious. The air pressure around him seemed to have dropped a lot. The image on the tablet was of a very special animal. It looked a little dreamy, but as Ranzai used to hold an important position under Sealang, he was too familiar with this icon. In fact, for the past 20 years, he would often dream of it. Every time he woke up, he would be covered in cold sweat. What do you mean? Ranzai no longer had a smile on his face. His face was very pale, and his voice was a little hoarse. Due to the sudden change in his emotions, his voice was trembling when he spoke. The Nightmare Taper, the military's secret project. Back at Sector M, Sillin had encountered the products of the Nightmare Taper project before. However, those products were not the most important project of the Nightmare Taper project. Based on the information Sillin knew, the first phase of the Nightmare Taper project was the DKC series of multi-purpose titanium guns, and the second phase was some weapons of mass destruction. The one Sillin encountered at Sector M was one of the second phase of the Nightmare Taper project. However, there was nothing in the information Sillin knew about wuxia at all. In the information given by wuxia, this was the symbol of the image. This image was slightly different from the one Sillin knew about the Nightmare Taper project. It carried a kind of evil aura. The Nightmare Taper project had begun a long time ago, and its starting point was the Nightmare Taper. The research that came later was actually a cover for this initial project. Once the cover was removed, the Nightmare Taper was what the people valued the most. Back then, Sifong was dismissed from his post and imprisoned because of the Nightmare Taper incident. 20 years later, wuxia said that the Nightmare Taper might make a comeback. Sillin paid no attention to Ranzai's expression and continued. I believe that you, as General Sifong's subordinate, should know this very well. Ranzai stared hard at Sillin for a while. He wanted to see the emotion in Sillin's eyes and what his goal was. However, Ranzai cannot see anything. Before this, he even thought that Sillin was troubled by the same thing as other young people his age. He would never have guessed that it would be this nightmarish thing, even if he was beaten to death. Moreover, since Sillin was able to mention Sifong and the fact that he used to hold an important position under Sifong, Ranzai knew that the young man in front of him might not know everything about him, but he had a general understanding of him. After some thought, Ranzai calmed himself down and said, "What's your goal?" Sillin shook his head. Ranzai was suspecting that he had bad intentions towards the Nightmare Taper, so Sillin had to explain himself. I know Pianhua's identity. I know some things about General Sifong back then. I also know about the mass imprisonment incident back then and the disaster in the highest prison. I know that all of you who participated in the Taper extermination incident back then have strong feelings of rejection and hatred towards the Nightmare Taper. However, do you think that all of you were able to exterminate it back then? Ranzai's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? I heard that although you guys destroyed that planet back then, some important information was still there. The people from Miracle continued the Nightmare Taper project with that information as the foundation. Over 20 years was enough for them to do many things. Lin Huang said, I heard that although you guys destroyed that planet back then, some important information was still there. Ranzai clenched his fists tightly as he listened to Sillin. The veins on the back of his hands popped up. It was terrifying. Isn't Orlos dead? Sillin could sense Ranzai's hatred towards Orlos from his tone. Orlos is dead, but the other interest groups are still around. The Nightmare Taper has gained a lot of supporters over the years, said Sillin. The benefits that the Nightmare Taper brought were enough to drive those people crazy. How could they let it go just because of Orlos? They had been waiting for decades for the nightmare taper to be born, right? However, back then, there was Fong who dared to be so ruthless. What about now? Who would do it? Even if they dared, it was already too late. Miracle has already taken over the Nightmare Taper follow-up project. The League of Stars is in a mess now. There are many people who support Miracle, but there are also many people who oppose Miracle. However, many people don't know that Miracle is carrying this demonic thing. If Miracle is going to be destroyed by then, they will definitely release the Nightmare Taper that they have been raising for so many years before they die, said Silen. Ranzai knew very well how crazy those people were. Many people had died in the Elimination Taper project back then, and he was one of the few survivors. It was because he had experienced it himself that he knew how terrifying that thing was. When the Elimination Taper project was launched back then, those things had not fully matured, so only a few people survived. However, if that thing had fully matured and was released, the consequences would be unimaginable. Ranzai stared straight at Silen. He wanted to see if Silen was telling the truth from Silen's eyes. Why should I believe what you said? Why should I believe that you won't be greedy for that thing? Greedy? Silen smiled. If I want to destroy a planet, I can do it any time. In this world, there are many things that can do that other than the Nightmare Taper. Silen's voice did not fluctuate much, and it sounded very calm. However, what he said sent chills down Ranzai's spine. With his eyes, he could tell that Silen was not lying. Ranzai had seen too many people who were the same age as Silen. However, the Silen in front of him made Ranzai change his impression of him over and over again. Destruction is easier than persuading and saving, so people prefer destruction. That was what Fong had said back then. Fong knew very well what those people would do with the Nightmare Taper. He knew what would happen if the nightmare spread. So he resisted the pressure and carried out the Elimination Taper project. The Nightmare Taper has a great name, but it's a combination of a nightmare and a nightmare. I don't know how much you know about it, but from what I know, it's a combination of two devils. They were originally a kind of microscopic parasite that could drift in space. Later, they were discovered by that group of people and put into research as a deadly virus carrier in another experiment. The experiment results were very successful. Since then, when those people carried out related research, they would use this parasite as a carrier to infect the target. That's because when this parasite exists, the deadly virus will concentrate on the parasite when there are no other hosts. The source of the virus can't be detected in the air. Even if it's in the water or the water next to the parasite, the source of the virus won't be detected. Moreover, the parasite that carries the virus isn't affected. That's why those people named this parasite the Nightmare Taper. The Nightmare Taper could devour nightmares and bring the nightmares that it had devoured back to life. For more research, those people modified the parasite so that it could carry more viruses at the same time. They also implanted control bodies in them. You can imagine that if someone wanted to destroy a certain organization on a planet, he wouldn't have to send a large number of elite troops, armored tanks, fighter jets, and so on. All he would have to do is to control a Nightmare Taper to enter the planet and infect humans and other living things. The virus can't be in the air or in pure water, but it can be transmitted from the Nightmare Taper to humans. The infected humans will then infect others. The Nightmare Taper is like a transfer station that transfers the virus to other living things. It will accumulate and infect others continuously. The spread of the virus is beyond people's imagination. If it happened on a planet that was isolated from the world, only the living things on the planet would be affected. However, what if it happened on a new planet that had frequent communication with the outside world? Then it would spread in a radial manner. Back then, there was a planet that was used as a test. It turned from a planet that was full of life into a dead planet. Thousands of deadly viruses wreaked havoc on the planet, and the cause was just a Nightmare Taper. No one had the time to create a vaccine or an effective medicine. It was gone just like that. That's why General C gave the order to destroy the taper after he learned about this. At this point, Ram let out a mocking laugh. Those people at Sector V are still clamoring about how the military is heartless, but they have no idea how much General C helped them back then. Originally, when the first batch of adult nightmare tapers were created, their main targets were the famous thugs in the League of Stars at Sector V. If General C hadn't destroyed the taper first, Sector V would have been cleansed 20 years ago. Osculos, the man they worship, is also one of the Nightmare Taper supporters. What right do they have to clamor? What right do they have to cheer after General C is imprisoned and talk about dogs biting each other? They don't understand anything. They don't understand anything. Rand stuffed his hands into his hair, lowered his head, and covered his eyes with his palms. It had been so many years, but the events of the past were still vivid in his mind. They had been wronged and punished, but they did not regret it. However, they felt pity for their brothers who had died. All their military achievements had been denied, and there were no longer any records about them in the files of the Star Alliance's army. They were people who had been abandoned by history. Sillin was silent. If Si Fong hadn't given the order to destroy the taper 20 years ago, and if the people who participated in the operation hadn't sacrificed their lives, there might not be Tang Kikikyu today. There might not be the Freedom Army, and there might not be the Sector V of today. Perhaps it would have become a colony a long time ago. From an all-powerful general to a prisoner in the League of Stars' highest prison, what kind of mentality did the people trapped in the prison feel when they experienced the ups and downs of life? When this life was over and they looked back, they still wouldn't regret what they did back then. It was their own choice, the life they decided to live. Si Fong was such a person back then. A general's personality could affect his subordinates. Ranzai told Sillin a lot about the Nightmare Taper. However, Ranzai didn't know much about it, so the advice she could give Sillin was limited. However, Ranzai replayed the taper eradication incident so that Sillin could better understand the people abandoned by history. Other than the Nightmare Taper, Ranzai also told Sillin about Si Fong and Pianhua. She was so emotional that she couldn't even stop talking. Back then, when the Supreme Prison was in trouble, General C handed Pianhua over to someone. That person owed General C a favor, and General C's request was for her to take Pianhua away. Moreover, in the future, she was to give Pianhua the right to choose and freedom. Pianhua's name came from that fire. After being in the prison, we understand the strong yearning for freedom better. However, I heard that General C was very calm in the prison. I don't know if General C was really as indifferent as they said, but I know that no matter what the result was, whether she was sentenced to prison or framed, General C didn't regret it. When the prison was on fire, the prison's protective net gate was opened by the prison warden so that the important people inside could escape. However, General C didn't leave. There were still a few people who followed her. Not only General C and the others, but some high-ranking military officials like General C didn't come out either. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, but they chose to stay inside. Actually, I know that General C didn't come out not only because of the so-called dignity of a soldier. She didn't want to implicate more people. Only when General C is gone, those who escaped and survived won't be restricted by the military. Si Fong was marked with Wei Ting's label, so the people who followed Si Fong were also marked with Wei Ting's label. Those people didn't stay there because of Wei Ting, but because of Si Fong. Just like what Wuxia said, if Si Fong was still alive, the military's current situation wouldn't be like this. Without Si Fong, the original subordinates all chose their own paths, choosing the direction they wanted. For example, Ranzai, if Si Fong was still alive, Ranzai would definitely continue to follow Si Fong and return to the military. However, Si Fong wasn't around, and Ranzai was recruited by people from Fire Phoenix. At first, Ranzai just muddled along, but after meeting Pianhua, he decided to officially stay in Fire Phoenix. Even if Pianhua often disguised himself, there were still times when he wasn't disguised. With one look, Ranzai could recognize him. This was because Pianhua and Si Fong looked too similar. Ranzai chatted with Sillin for a long time. After they finished, Ranzai adjusted his emotions and walked out. Walking the passageway, Ranzai felt a little strange. He felt that he had said too much today. Although there were some things that he was prepared to tell Sillin, he still said too much. As he walked, Ranzai's footsteps slowed down. The expression on his face changed a few times. Finally, he laughed and scolded, "Stinking brat, you actually hypnotized me." Chapter 4:01. Ranzai wasn't angry at Silen's hypnosis. After all, he came from the military, and he knew a little about hypnosis. He knew that Silen meant no harm. At first, Ranzai just wanted to see if Silen was lying from Silen's eyes, but he fell for it himself. It was easier for a person to trigger their true emotions through eye contact. Ranzai was excited just now. He had been holding it in for more than 20 years, and he had always wanted to vent the words in his heart. However, it was a secret that could not be made public. Only a handful of people knew about it, and it could only be buried in history. Silen, on the other hand, only played the role of a primer. He didn't forcefully interfere with Ranzai's emotions, and that was why Ranzai wasn't angry. Ranzai had said everything he wanted to say, and Silen didn't force him to say anything else. Ranzai remained tight-lipped. That was enough. Back then, Silen learned the general situation of the taper eradication incident from Wuxia, and today he learned more detailed information from Ranzai. Many of his doubts were answered now. The person who owed Si Fong a favor and took Bianhua away was the current leader of Fire Phoenix, the current Fire Phoenix. Only this person had the ability to protect Bianhua from the fire back then. The current Fire Phoenix fulfilled his promise, and he didn't force Bianhua no matter how much he thought highly of her. He respected Bianhua's choice and allowed her to roam freely when the prison was still there. Now he did the same. Moreover, Bianhua had received some help from Si Huang. Up until now, Bianhua hadn't encountered any serious threat to her life. At least, that was what Bianhua showed others. Due to Ranzai's occupation, he couldn't explain the nightmare taper in detail, and he didn't provide much help to Silen. However, he told Silen that if he wanted to know more about the nightmare taper, he could look for a person, Onesta. Onesta was one of the officers under Si Fong's command, and he had participated in the taper eradication operation. Just like Ranzai, he wasn't locked up in the highest prison and survived to this day. He was absorbed by Sector S's forces. Most importantly, Onesta's profession was important. Back then, Onesta was a military doctor. He was valued by Si Fong because he could follow a military doctor to the front line. It went without saying that he should know a lot more about the nightmare taper. Onesta wasn't in Fire Phoenix. A long time ago, before the prison was revoked and everyone was thrown into the prison after being stripped of their military uniforms. Compared to Ranzai and the others, Onesta was treated better. This was because there were people to take care of him. Many knew that the prison system of Sector had connections with the local forces. Fong. Sector S's prison had Sector had. And Bar. Pin. Queen was the queen, and Queen had was Sector. Onesta was one of Ingenia's targets, and they had grown familiar with each other. That was why Ingenia had sent someone to fetch Onesta as soon as the prison was revoked. Once Silen arrived at Golden Beginning, he would be able to find Onesta and learn more about the situation. The people Ingenia sent to fetch Silen soon arrived, and they were led by Zhen Xingfu. Zhen Xingfu's gene rank had skyrocketed after the second injection, and his physique was like heaven and earth compared to before. However, Zhen Xingfu still gave off the impression that he was as thin and weak as he was before. There were two reasons why Zhen Xingfu looked thin and weak. First, they didn't want to make it public. Zhen Xingfu had kept the fact that his physique had changed a secret, and no one except the few closest people knew that his Zhen Xingji and Genxing's innate qualities had changed drastically. In the past, they could only rely on their bodyguards to assassinate them, and if their bodyguards were unreliable, they could only rely on weapons and protective equipment. If none of those worked, then they could only pray for their own good. But now, they might be able to deliver a fatal blow to their target when they weren't paying attention. Secondly, Zhen Xingfu's attire was loose and empty. Ingenia must have purposely designed it so that he would look the same as before, and Zhen Xingfu's deliberate disguise was enough to fool people. Although Zhen Xingfu still gave off the impression that he was as thin and weak as he used to be, his temperament had changed. Just like Pianhui said, Zhen Xingfu was a lot brighter than before. He was no longer as gloomy and fickle as before. "We finally meet again, Silin." Jin Xingfu strode forward and fist-bumped Silin. At the same time, he also greeted Hui Mao, who was lying on Silin's shoulder. Hui Mao responded politely. Jin Xingfu was the descendant of his second grandpa's master, so he counted as one of his own. Of course, he had to treat his own people differently. Ranzai watched the conversation between Jin Xingfu and Silin from the side. He knew that Ingenia valued Silin a lot, but he didn't think that Silin and Jin Xingfu would be this close. There were a lot of people in Sector S who knew that the Jin family were untrustworthy and unapproachable people. However, it was obvious that Jin Xingfu was familiar with Silin, and the smile on his face wasn't formal or perfunctory. It was sincere. Ranzai's opinion of Silin rose even higher. "Yo, young Master Fu, I can't believe you're the one who led the team here." "How rare," Pianhua exclaimed. They were all acquaintances, so they spoke more casually than usual. Everyone in their generation had worked together before the three great forces came to power, so they knew each other very well. "Of course, it's rare for Silin to show up, so it's only natural that we come to welcome him." Jin Xingfu chatted with Ran and Pianhua for a bit longer before he dragged Silin away like he was in a hurry. His grandmother was still waiting for him at Golden Beginnings headquarters. After Golden Beginnings Starship had left, Pianhua stroked his fake beard and said, "I can't shake the feeling that Ingenia and the Jin family are too close to Silin. They almost look like family." "I would have thought the same if there wasn't no concrete proof after multiple investigations," Ranzai replied. As one of the three great forces, they had investigated the leaders of Golden Beginning many times before. However, there was no evidence that Queen Ingenia had another child, and Jinsheng only had a son and a daughter. "Have you found anything about Queen Ingenia's husband?" Pianhua asked. "No, that person is too mysterious, and he's still a mystery to this day." Ranzai had investigated the trash that the elders of Sector S mentioned many times, but the more he investigated, the more puzzled he became. The trash that everyone mentioned was familiar with the Food King, and his origins were unknown. It was said that he was a person from outside of Sector S, and he disappeared after that. Some people said that the trash was dead because his gene rank was very low, and he couldn't support a long lifespan. He had already started aging when he disappeared back then, so one could only imagine what had happened to him after so many years had passed. However, Ranzai couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Queen Ingenia was a famous person in Sector S, and she was the one who single-handedly developed Golden Beginning to its current scale and status. However, the trash that everyone called Jin family had always been in her heart. If he really was a trash without any merits, how could the great queen of Golden Beginning have been obsessed with him for so many years? How could he be so close to the Food King? So close to the extent that the Food King would mercilessly slap his own children and descendants away if they spoke ill of him. Pianhua suddenly thought of something and asked Ranzai, "What was the name of the person you mentioned back then?" Ranzai thought for a moment and answered, "I remember. His name was Genya." "Genya?" Pianhua sucked in a deep breath. "The planet I visited this time is the birthplace of Silin. I learned that Silin's master is also called Genya." Pianhua didn't know about Genya because Silin told her. She learned it from the information of the local population, and she had investigated the little yard when she chose it as a shelter. She heard that the owner of the yard had been dead for many years. "Is what you said true?" Ranzai was surprised. If it was true, then the trash that everyone called him back then wasn't trash after all. At the very least, a person who could raise a disciple like Silin was definitely no ordinary person. "I remember that there was a tree in that yard that looked very similar to the one I saw at Golden Beginnings headquarters. Although I could only catch a glimpse of it at Golden Beginning and couldn't see it up close, I'm sure it's the same kind of tree. That kind of tree was very special and strange." Pianhua had been to many places, but she had never seen a tree similar to the one at Golden Beginning. However, the almost bald tree in Silin's yard was the same kind of tree as the one at Golden Beginning. While Pianhua and Ranzai were discussing Silin and Genya, Jin Xingfu had brought Silin and the others to Golden Beginnings headquarters. This time, Angenia and Jinxing welcomed them personally. Unlike last time, there were two more people this time. One was Jin Xingfu's younger sister, Jin Xingji, and the other was the star hunter Prisa, who often kept Jin Xingji here. This was the first time Silin met Prisa. She was Jin Xingfu's aunt, and it was impossible to tell her age based on her appearance. However, the temperament and charm that flowed out of her every movement told everyone that she wasn't a young girl who knew nothing, but someone who had experienced many things and had a story to tell. There were rumors that Prisa and Jinsheng were biological siblings, and that they were both born to Angenia. However, there were other theories as well. In short, Prisa's background was a mystery to many people. That being said, Silin knew that Prisa and Jinsheng couldn't be biological siblings. Prisa didn't have the Jin family's bloodline, and she had displayed great strength and high gene rank from the very beginning. She wasn't like Jinsheng and the others who had the Jin family's bloodline. Moreover, Silin believed that Angenia wouldn't look for another man. However, Prisa must have a lot of connections to become a star hunter, and it was far beyond anyone's imagination. After all, Sector S was a prison sector back in the day. Anything could happen in a place like this. Angenia, who always gave off a dignified image, smiled lovingly when she saw Silin. She pulled Silin aside and spoke to him. Those who had seen this before were immune to it, but those who hadn't were completely stunned by it. Even if they didn't show it on their faces, they were shocked to the core. Is this Silin the Queen's illegitimate son? Or is he Boss Yuan's illegitimate son? That being said, young Master Fu wouldn't be smiling so happily if he was Boss Yuan's illegitimate son. The smiles on these people's faces weren't faked. Jin Xingji and her older brother were standing behind their father and grandmother. They were staring curiously at the young man who was chatting happily with her grandmother. He looked to be about the same age as her. So how did he make her serious grandmother smile like that? That's the kind of smile a grandmother should have toward a junior, isn't it? It was pitifully rare for her and her older brother to smile like this. Angenia brought Silin to the courtyard where the Fuji tree was planted. There were a few Fuji trees that were growing pretty well in the courtyard. The reason why the Fuji tree was called the upper tree was because it was special compared to other plants. It could grow 10 years in 1 year, or it could not grow even a centimeter in 10 years. It all depended on the mood of the tree, and the main factor that affected the tree's mood was the Jin family. The tree would only grow in a place where the Jin family was present. For example, the Fuji tree was growing very well when Jinya was still in the courtyard on planet Brown Earth. It was so lush that it looked like a 100-year-old tree in just a short time. However, the tree stopped growing after Jinya left, and it was growing worse every year. The Fuji tree in Golden Beginnings courtyard might not be as good as the tree in the courtyard on planet Brown Earth, but it was still a rare sight. Perhaps Jinya didn't expect that the seeds he gave to Angenia as a gift would grow to such an extent, right? Very few people could enter this courtyard. Even Pianhua, who came with Fire Phoenix as a guest, could only look at it through the wall. Therefore, Silin didn't have to worry too much about this place. Here, Angenia looked around the courtyard, wondering if she should find a better empty space. Silin waved his hand and pointed at a spot in the middle of the trees. That's fine. As he said this, Silin walked over and crouched down on the empty space in the middle of the trees. He stretched out his finger and pressed the curly leaf pattern against the ground. The next moment, there was a crackling sound. A large tree seemed to break out of the ground. Although it was bald, its branches were thicker than the branches of the trees in the courtyard. Following the appearance of this tree, the surrounding trees first moved outwards as if to make room for this tree. After the tree appeared and stabilized, they all moved closer to it. After the tree broke out of the ground, its roots under the ground began to grow. It was here that it sensed a familiar presence that it hadn't seen for a long time. This made it very happy. The immediate reaction of its happiness was that green buds began to sprout on its originally bald branches. The buds grew larger and denser. Jin Xingfu and the others were stunned. Even Jinsheng and Angenia, who had some understanding of the Fuji tree, were stunned by this scene. Angenia knew that the Fuji tree had spirit energy. Jinya had told her many things about this tree, but she had never seen it with her own eyes. This was the first time she had felt it so deeply. Angenia knew that the Fuji tree had spiritual energy. Jinya had told her many things about the tree, but she had never seen it with her own eyes. This was the first time she felt so strongly about it. Yes, it's always been in his courtyard. He likes to sit on the wooden rocking chair under this tree and look at the sky. The tree reminded Sillin of the past. Yes, it's always been in his courtyard. He likes to sit on the wooden rocking chair under this tree and look at the sky. The tree reminded Sillin of the past. However, those people might not be able to reappear in the future. Angenia wanted to stay here for a while longer. As for what Sillin had told her about Ernest, Angenia told Jin Xingfu to take Sillin to find him. Jin Xingfu asked Sillin a lot of excited questions about his grandfather Jinya while they were on their way to find him. Sillin told him some of the things he knew, but he chose to keep the most important things to himself. It might not necessarily be a good thing to reveal them now. Jin Xingji wrinkled his nose at Sillin's tight-lipped behavior. Is he really that mysterious? Even Grandma and Aunt Prisa couldn't find out what kind of person Grandpa was, even though he had never met him before. Jin Xingji's frustration was directly manifested in the way he and Hui Mao were making faces and sticking out their tongues at each other on Sillin's shoulder. This was the first time Jin Xingji had seen a cat with such rich expressions and a mouth full of lies. Ernest had been researching the secret of Jin Xingfu and the others' bodies changing overnight. He hurriedly came out to greet them when he was informed that someone had come to visit. Since Angenia had greeted him earlier, Ernest didn't dare to be too slow. He wanted to get more information out of Jin Xingfu. However, Sillin suggested a private conversation with Ernest and emphasized that he had a heart-to-heart talk with Ran earlier. Ernest's heart skipped a beat when he heard this. He felt worried for no reason. As expected, Sillin told him about the nightmare taper not long after they entered the meeting room. After Ran's introduction, Sillin also knew where to start and how to communicate with the people who had participated in the taper eradication operation. A long period of silence later, Ernest stood up and left. He returned with a storage device in his hand. Everything I know about the nightmare taper is in here. Ernest had tried to find other ways to solve the problem for many years, but he never made any progress. In the end, he put it aside. Sillin accepted the storage device and said, "Thank you. This is all I can do. I hope you can find a way to solve the problem. I'll try my best." While Jin Xingfu and Jin Xingji were waiting outside, Prissa came over as well. "Where's Sillin?" Prissa asked curiously. Jin Xingji curled his lips at the meeting room's direction and said, "He's having a private conversation." The meeting room door opened just after Jin Xingji finished speaking. Sillin and Onista walked out of the meeting room one after another. Onista had already adjusted his mental state, and the smile on his face had returned. He saluted Prisa when he saw her. Prissa's gaze landed on Sillin. She knew Sillin better than anyone else, and she knew what Sillin was capable of. She knew some of the more secretive things Sillin had done in the past, including the time he destroyed Miracle's key research base at Sector C. What was it that required such a long, private conversation? Prissa was curious. "I know about you, Sillin. My little nephew often mentions you," Prissa said. Although Jin Xingfu called Prissa his aunt, Sillin had a feeling that the little nephew Prissa mentioned wasn't Jin Xingfu, but someone else. Chapter 402. In the past, Prissa was a mystery to everyone. In the past, everyone thought that she was a lone hunter who didn't belong to any force. Although she wasn't as lone as Osculos, she did come from a relatively clean background compared to the others. However, it was gradually revealed that Prissa had a close relationship with one of the three titans of Sector S, Golden Beginning. That being said, the information wasn't necessarily true or complete. Just like how Prissa referred to him as her little nephew now. Jin Xingfu must have mentioned Sillin before, but Prissa's tone made Sillin feel like she was talking about someone else. However, Prissa wasn't here for Sillin. After Jin Xingfu and Jin Xingji left with Sillin, Prissa asked Onista about it. Onista didn't tell her the specifics. He only mentioned the key points. The nightmare taper. Prissa frowned. She was annoyed by the term as of late. The military was slowly coming to an end, and some of the people who supported Miracle had changed their stance. After Orlas's death, the support behind Miracle had begun to decrease drastically, and the situation was even more obvious now that the 8 Corps were fighting against each other openly and covertly. Prissa sighed. Why would he want to come into contact with that? In Prissa's opinion, it wasn't something a hunter like Scylla should pay attention to. If he were to get involved in something like this, he would only be at a disadvantage. In fact, he might even get himself killed in the end. There was no absolute right or wrong when it came to Miracle. It was possible that something you thought was right would end tragically, just like what happened to Si Fong back in the day. Back then, there were some people who were imprisoned in the highest prison, and the so-called heinous crimes they committed were nothing more than a label they were forced to put on them after the fact. It was because Prissa understood the importance of this issue, the general trend of the world, and how important Scylla was to Angenia, Jinsheng, and the others. That was why she thought so highly of this issue. After thinking for a while, Prissa hurried back to the courtyard to talk to Angenia, who was still deep in thought. That night, Angenia went to talk to Scylla. As a senior, Angenia treated Scylla as her own grandson. In fact, she valued him even more than Jin Xingfu and Jin Xingji. After Prissa told her about Scylla's situation, Angenia thought about it for a while and came to talk to Scylla alone after dinner. She didn't object directly. She wanted to hear Scylla's opinion. Jinya definitely wouldn't have brought someone with him who was stupid or blind. You know, Master isn't a member of the League of Stars. He's from another galaxy, Scylla said as he looked at Angenia, who was waiting for his explanation. Angenia knew some of Jinya's secrets, but she wasn't very clear about them. She knew what Scylla was talking about, but she didn't say anything and listened to Scylla's explanation. I can go there, but the number of people who can pass is limited. The technology is still in development, and it isn't mature yet. This is why Master hasn't come to see you yet. Queen Angenia was able to deduce a lot of things from the fact that Scylla had brought Golden Beginning to where he was today. Is still the same as before. He doesn't want to drag us down at all. Angenia sighed. In the current situation, Jinya's appearance would definitely make him a target. If Jinya's forces were weak, then even if Angenia, Jinsheng, and the others didn't mind, Jinya wouldn't do something like this. Scylla shot Angenia a glance before continuing. Azrael's people, Ji Feng's people, and maybe even more people know that I possess this technology. If a full-blown disaster breaks out, Ji Feng and Azrael's people will definitely force me to open the passage to the other side. If that happens, it won't be a good thing for both Mist Bodhisattva and the League of Stars. On the other hand, I can't just run away with my people. The fact that Wuxia managed to contact Scylla so quickly and divulge some information from time to time meant that it wasn't just about Huimao. Scylla had a feeling that Wuxia knew that he possessed the technology as well. If a full-blown disaster broke out, Wuxia would definitely leave with his people, and the way to leave lay in Scylla's hands. Otherwise, why would Wuxia suddenly express goodwill at a time of chaos like this after holding back and observing for so many years? Moreover, if a full-blown disaster broke out, Scylla could escape with only the 11th squad, but most of the 11th squad's people were still here. Angenia's group, Mo Heng's group, Lung's group, and so on were still here. How were they supposed to leave with their roots here? How were they supposed to leave on their own? Once a person ran away once, they would run away a second and a third time. The first time they ran away would leave the deepest scar in their hearts. When they thought back on it later, they would realize that they had abandoned their homes, abandoned their former comrades, and abandoned their people. It was a betrayal. There was nothing a hunter hated more than betrayal. There was no such thing as absolute obedience to a hunter's orders. It was more about following one's heart. Sure, Tang's research was nearing its end, but if he couldn't keep up with the research, there was no way he could send everyone away before the disaster broke out. Because of Chip, the last of the 5 brothers, you had started divulging some of the key technologies to Shurtang. They were hoping to perfect the technology as soon as possible. Scylla told Angenia a lot of things. He didn't tell her part of the reason, but he just wanted to show her his determination. After listening to Scylla's explanation, Angenia knew that Silen's explanation wasn't complete, but she didn't probe further. She knew that Silen had made up his mind, so she didn't try to persuade him. Instead, she said, Miracle's research bases are all over the League of Stars. Some of them are known by the military, and some of them are hidden. According to Onista, those people are really crazy. That was just the beginning. Onista and the others thought that they had destroyed all the information about the Nightmare Taper, but they didn't expect that there were still backups. There were even some intact samples. Where are they hidden? Si Fong, who had planned everything meticulously, couldn't find them. Therefore, even if a few divisions of the military worked together, they might not be able to eliminate all the threats. Therefore, the entire League of Stars will face the same disaster almost at the same time. It won't be just one place. Who can avoid it? Silen crossed his arms on his knees and said, if such a disaster really happens, I'll get them to open the tunnel first and send you guys over. No, Angenia rejected immediately. You said that the technology isn't comprehensive, and there's a limit to the number of people we can send. There's so many people in Golden Beginning, and they call me Queen. I have to live up to that title. What about Jin Sheng, Jin Xingfu, and the rest? They won't leave either. Angenia smiled. I know them. Silen paused and asked, how long do we have? Prisa said that some of the important management members of Miracle committed suicide not long after they were captured. When they committed suicide, they were all laughing maniacally. As for the exact time, the military can't say for sure. After all, the targets were those crazy people from Miracle. I heard that the person controlling those things hasn't been found yet. The Miracle people left some samples back then. However, there was only one success when they conducted the Nightmare Tapers experiment again. That was the only female Nightmare Taper that succeeded. I believe Onista has told you how to deal with a Nightmare Taper. The things released as virus carriers will listen to the orders of the Nightmare Taper. However, the main body has yet to be found by the military's legions. Prisa had told Angenia all of this. Angenia was telling Silen this because she wanted to tell Silen that there was no way he could help even if he wanted to. It was unnecessary. Finding the Nightmare Taper was the only way. There were so many people in the military, political organizations, and big families looking for it. How much could Silen do with his little manpower? It's fine. Silen smiled. I'll stay here with you guys. I don't dare to meet Master alone. Silen contacted Yudi after talking to Angenia. G-Phone was going to clean up the hunter regiments again and collect resources on a large scale. Moreover, they would avoid some of the more prosperous star zones once the war started. That way, they would be able to avoid the impending disaster. Silen told Yudi and the 11th Squad to join the operation. With G-Fang's capabilities, he definitely knew some inside information and knew that a great disaster was coming. However, the hunters who traveled through space wouldn't suffer as much of a blow as the others. They could choose to avoid the disaster zone. Silen even contacted a U alone, help Shirtang, and speed up the research. We don't have much time left. If anything happens, take everyone away from the League of Stars and return to Mist Bodhisattva. A moment of silence later, Moon answered, all right. This time, his answer was very formal. What about you? Moon asked again. Don't worry about us. Wheeze, Cheto, and I will be fine. You fell silent again. After the call with Silen, the 11th Squad's equipment malfunctioned for the second time. It was because Moon was overthinking again. Early the next morning, Prisa came to Silen's resting place to wait for him. Silen, my little nephew wants to talk to you, Prisa said with a helpless look on her face. Prisa led Silen to a secret room. Silen knew just how confidential their conversation was going to be when he saw the setup of the equipment inside. Who on earth was acting so secretive? What Silen didn't expect was that Prisa left on her own after she brought Silen inside, leaving Silen alone. A moment later, a light screen popped up. The person on the screen was very familiar to Silen. Long time no see, Silen. Silen stared at the person on the screen and smiled. I didn't think that the little nephew Prisa mentioned would be you. Long time no see, C.I. Jincheng. On the screen, C.I. Jincheng spread his hands. The matters of the elders are too complicated to be explained clearly. If I were to sum it up in one sentence, It would be the F asterisk king love between a prisoner of the highest level prison and a local. Sillin couldn't help but laugh. Just what kind of blow did C.I. Jinsheng suffer for him swear? What's wrong? Is there something urgent that requires a star-rank hunter to act as a messenger? Sillin asked, I heard that you're going to participate in the Nightmare Tapers matter? I'm just taking a look. I'm alone after all, so I'll try my best to help out when the time comes. It'll count as me doing my part. Sillin said. C.I. Jinsheng was silent for a moment before asking, Are you sure? Yes. All right then. Come and help me. On the screen, C.I. Jinsheng smiled. I'm going to form a special team to deal with the Nightmare Taper. The military should have such a special team, right? Yes, but I want to form one myself. I don't have much say in that team, and I don't agree with the person in charge. C.I. Jinsheng didn't finish his sentence. Other than these reasons, the C.I. family was also interfering. Those special teams were going to enter the disaster area, and the C.I. family was reluctant to let C.I. Jinsheng go. However, it was obvious that C.I. Jinsheng was a stubborn and uncontrollable person. After Prisa told him that Sillin was interested in interfering with the Nightmare Taper, C.I. Jinsheng hastily came up with a plan. It was a plan for the Taper Extermination Project team that he had formed himself. Who else is in your team? Sillin asked. C.I. Jinsheng blinked. Everyone in our dorm was here before. Some people will join us too, such as Ulu, Kong Man, Pride, Alan. Listening to the familiar names that he hadn't seen for a long time, Sillin said, All right, I'll join you. But will the G family agree to Pride? Pride will take care of it himself. He already promised that. I'll bring someone and a cat over. Cheto and Wheeze, right? I know. Come with my aunt when the time comes. I've already told her. To your side? And Min, I have an experimental base on an asteroid here. All right, we'll contact each other when we get there. On the second day after they arrived at Golden Beginnings headquarters, Sillin left with Prisa. Sillin and Prisa left separately and met up somewhere outside of Sector S. No one, including Jen Xingfu, knew that Prisa would leave with Sillin in secret. This time, Prisa, who usually brought Jen Xingji with her, excused herself and left on her own. Jen Xingji was depressed for a long time because of this. Sillin, are we going to do something big this time? Lying on Sillin's shoulder, Hui Mao said weakly and emphasized the word big. Yes, something big. Nonsense. I heard everything you said. Hui Mao played with his front paws and pulled at his ears. He complained, Why don't we leave and leave this place alone? No, you humans are so complicated. Hui Mao sighed. I'm fine. You know I'm immune to those things. Sillin scratched Hui Mao's chin. After going through the zebra virus, Sillin had developed a resistance to many deadly viruses. Hui Mao knew this. Sillin was more knowledgeable in this field, and so was the gray cat. However, how could he do something as stupid as doing something big without leaving his name? Even if he couldn't make a name for himself, he should at least be rewarded with a huge sum of money. This time, he didn't get anything, and he still had to sneak around. It was nowhere near as sensational as it was back in the Mist Bodhisattva sect. Although it was only a small incident, it had benefited Wheeze a lot since then. The successful establishment of the forum especially allowed Wheeze to satisfy its celebrity addiction. Hui Mao scratched Sillin's clothes with his claws. He wasn't happy to work for free. The life and death of other people had nothing to do with him. He wouldn't feel anything even if the entire League of Stars, including the hunting planet where he was born, were destroyed. It's because it can avoid some trouble in the future, Sillin said. Hui Mao didn't understand what Sillin meant, and he couldn't be bothered to think about it either. After licking his claws, he curled into a ball and fell asleep on Sillin's legs. Priest's space plane didn't have any special markings, but it was unimpeded after entering Sector C. Her flight path was special. It was obvious that she had prepared for this long ago. Sillin was surprised that Prisa was related to the CI family by blood. It was no wonder that Prisa was able to become a star rank hunter. Other than her own abilities, her connections were also very strong. The planet CI Jinsheng mentioned was at the edge of Sector C and close to Sector B. Following the chaos of the League of Stars, Some of the famous schools in Sector B had become much quieter. They were far less lively than before. In this chaos in the Star Alliance, many forces had fallen from power. Many students, who had gone from experts to experts, could not even afford to pay their school fees. There were also some people who were protected by their families due to political reasons and did not return to school. As for the teachers in the school, some of the more experienced ones like Mo Hung had been snatched away by various parties. Those with important achievements in engineering, medicine, materials, and so on were all busy accepting commissions. Where would they find the time to take care of students? It had been a long time since Sillin had been to Seven Lights. While he was thinking, Prisa told Sillin that they were almost there. The image of a planet was already displayed on the screen. This planet wasn't a habitable planet. Its habitability didn't even reach rank C. The planet was covered in protective shields, and almost all of the protective shields were enclosed bases. From the outside, the planet looked very attractive. However, when Sillin and the others reached the planet and landed in the base, they were greeted by a different scene. An artificial, steady-state environment? Sillin looked at the interior of the base and sighed. The inside of the base was like an independent little world. There were forests, streams, and 4 seasons of the year. The air was pleasant. These were all man-made, and many of them were the application of new technology. Hui Mao started rolling on the grass after entering the base, rubbing and sniffing here and there. He habitually marked the places he was satisfied with. "I've been waiting for you for a long time, Sillin." A person walked over from not far away and said. The person was not C.I. Jincheng, but Sillin's classmate from 7 Lights years ago. Long time no see, Kong Man. Chapter 403. Back then, Kong Man was still an arrogant and stubborn young man. He and Pride were known as the twin stars of 7 Lights. A few years had passed, and Kong Man's arrogance had lessened a lot. Perhaps it was because he had gone through a lot of things and learned to hide his emotions. However, Kong Man was still very happy when he saw Sillin. C.I. Jincheng had told him beforehand that Sillin would be joining them. Although Sillin was no longer the same as before, it did not affect Kong Man's opinion of Sillin. This was especially true when he learned that Sillin's shadow was behind the miracle at a certain base at Sector C. Kong Man truly admired him. Sillin introduced Cheto and Hui Mao to Kong Man. Hui Mao glanced lazily at Kong Man and continued to mark the territory. Kong Man did not know how many people this newly formed Taper extermination team had, or who they were. He only knew a part of them. Lung wasn't here. C.I. Jincheng told Sillin that according to young Master Lung, they were working together from the inside and outside. Young Master Lung would investigate from the outside and then report back to the squad. After all, the military and civilian might not receive the same information, and young Master Lung had many unorthodox methods, so he would be able to obtain a lot more information. Kong Man led Sillin into the interior of the base. The research area was a little far from here, and there were some training grounds in between. When Sillin followed Kong Man past there, he just so happened to run into a couple of people coming out. When they saw Sillin, they were stunned for a moment. Then, the person walking at the front quickly rushed over and grabbed Sillin's neck, shouting, "You've finally appeared." Sillin elbowed him with a backhand. "If you used any more strength, my neck would have been broken." "Then you deserve it." Although he said that, Knight still loosened his arm. However, he still punched Sillin a couple of times. "You're so mysterious that you always disappear." "Can't help it. I'm a hunter." Sillin rubbed his shoulder. "Knight really did use some strength." "Bullshit. I've never seen anyone like you. Huntress. You're just like Fog and Wuxia. You'll disappear after a while, and come out again after a while." The few people standing at the entrance of the training room smiled as they looked over. Among them were Yu Lu and Feng Haichao, whom Sillin was familiar with. However, the way they looked at Sillin was a little strange. They kept thinking about Miracle's base. This was especially true for Yu Lu. He had seen Cheto's face before, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw Cheto's face. He suddenly recalled the strange man who had fought Stola to a standstill inside Miracle's base. Was it really him? So strong? Since when did Sillin have such an expert by his side? "Yo, are you done with your training, boys?" Prissa, who was walking behind them, said. "You're back. Knight raised his hand in greeting. I was wondering when my presence was so low that people could ignore me, Priestess said. Not at all, not at all. Knight and the others shook their heads in unison. They still needed the help of an expert like Prisa during their upcoming training, or they wouldn't make much progress if they trained alone. It was obvious that Prisa's guidance would be more effective. In fact, Prisa's main reason for coming here was to accept CI Jincheng's invitation and help train these youngsters. These people might be the elites of the military, but they were far from reaching Priest's standards. They were going to face Miracle, a famous bionic warrior from Monster Corporation. Since they had joined the Taper extermination team, it was only natural that Prisa had high expectations for their strength. The gray cat crouched on Silen's shoulder and stared at these people. It recognized Yulu, and it had met him a couple of times already. It knew that this person was present back at Miracle's base, but Silen had told it to ignore him, so it didn't act. He didn't think that he would become a teammate of the Taper extermination team. But this kid's strength, feeling Hui Mao's gaze, Yulu looked over. He himself was wondering why Silen's pet would look at him with such a disdainful gaze. They had seen Hui Mao when they were on missions in the past, and knew that this cat was special. But this gaze was really irritating. You're Wheeze, right? Do you have something against me? Yulu walked over and looked at the fat cat crouching on Silen's shoulder as he asked. Hui Mao flicked his ears and turned his head away. You're too weak. Everyone around him stared at him. Too weak. Yulu was considered the cream of the crop among the young men in the army. However, this was the first time that Yulu had received such an evaluation. Moreover, the one who evaluated him was a cat with a gaze full of disdain. Prisa couldn't help but laugh. This is the first time Yulu has heard such an evaluation. Wheeze, you're too much of a blow. No, I don't lie, Hui Mao said righteously. Knight and the others continued to stare at him. This statement was even more of a blow. Yulu's face twitched a couple of times. He didn't know what to say. Before Prisa could continue, Hui Mao pointed a paw at Cheto and said, Cheto can beat them with one hand. This time, everyone except Yulu and Knight broke their silence. They were about as strong as Yulu, and although Hui Mao was talking about Yulu, it felt like he had dragged them into the conversation as well. Right now, Yulu was even more certain that Cheto was that person from the Miracle base. Knight continued to remain silent because Lung had told him about Cheto before. He hadn't personally witnessed how powerful Cheto was, but according to Lung, there was no way he could measure the strength of a non-human. He was a monster just like Silen. Who would know that the man in front of them was actually a robot? Moreover, only idiots would fight a strange robot head-on. All right. You guys have rested enough, haven't you? Then get back to training. I'll check your progress. Prisa pushed them back to the training field. Yulu glanced at Silen and Cheto before following her inside. Silen, I'm going to train for a while. I'll come find you and CI Jincheng when I'm done. While saying this, Knight also turned around and walked into the training field. Before he turned around, he swiftly flicked Hui Mao's ear as if he was taking revenge. Hui Mao bared his teeth. If these people weren't his teammates, he would have stretched out his claws a long time ago. Kongman was only interested in Silen's research abilities. He didn't know much about the other's strength, but from their conversation, he could feel that the current Silen had changed greatly compared to when he was at Seven Lights. If Silen's men were this strong, then Silen couldn't be bad either. But envy was one thing, but Kongman knew his own position very well. He also knew that he didn't have much to contribute in terms of combat ability, so it was better to work on the direction he was interested in. While Kongman was looking for CI Jincheng with Silen inside the training room. Only a few people had gone out earlier, and there were still a few people inside. When Feng Hai Chao and the others returned and told them what happened just now, the people inside the training room immediately exploded. However, because Prisa was here, everyone endured it. They were all elites of this generation. Who could remain calm after hearing such extremely disdainful words? Do you know Cheto's strength? Prisa asked while looking at the people inside the room. No one answered. The discussion became much quieter, and some people even murmured in a low voice. Knight, Yulu, you should have heard some things about Cheto. What do you think? Prisa asked again. It was only now Feng Haichao remembered that neither Yulu nor Knight had said anything just now. At first, he thought that Knight was silent because of Sillin, but it didn't look like that was the case. I heard that he's very strong, Knight said seriously. Heard? Ruo Lin frowned. Ruo Lin frowned and wasn't satisfied with Knight's words. The others weren't satisfied with Knight's hearsay either. Was there no truth to it? Yulu was about to tell them about the scene he saw at the Miracle Base when Prisa spoke first. Then I'll tell you something I've heard. Although I haven't seen it with my own eyes, the person who told me this wouldn't lie. Everyone fell completely silent and listened to Prisa's next words. Among the 6 stars of Hunt, Prisa was the only person who didn't look like a star hunter. She wasn't high and mighty, and she was easy to get along with. If one didn't know that she was one of the 6 stars of Hunt, no one would associate her with the 6 stars of Hunt. Although the military worshipped Heaven's edict more than the hunters, the people here didn't share the same opinion. Maybe it was because Prisa was C.I. Jincheng's aunt and a trustworthy person that they respected her more. Or maybe it was because they were too disappointed in some of the people in the military that their worship had shifted. Under everyone's gaze, Prisa continued. You all know the 2 famous assassin organizations in the League of Stars, Mist and Wuxia. Then let me use the people from Mist as a comparison. A while ago, an old friend told me that Mist lost 3 people. Among the 3, Swiftblade Tires died by Cheto's hand, and Cheto was unharmed. Silence. A long silence. Even if they hadn't fought Swiftblade Tires directly, they still knew a little about his strength. A person who could kill Swiftblade Tires and come out unscathed. Then, what about the other 2 of the 3? Roland asked with difficulty. Prisa looked at him. Isn't there still Sillin? A collective gasp sounded. The corner of Knight's mouth twitched again and again. He cursed in his mind. That bastard Lung. Why didn't he tell me about Sillin? Since when did Sillin become so strong? Mother asterisk Kerr. After Prisa was done, she looked at the equipment at the side of the training room and smiled. At this moment, Hui Mao, who was lying on Sillin's shoulder and grinning cheekily, suddenly froze. Then he cried out, Meow! That woman discovered me. Sillin knocked on Hui Mao's head. That's what you get for eavesdropping on us so blatantly. Hui Mao's ears turned and said stubbornly, I was careless. If I had gotten serious, that woman might not have been able to discover me. Walking at the front, Kong Man thought about the conversation between Sillin and Hui Mao in confusion. Why didn't he understand what they were talking about? When they arrived at the research area, C.I. Jincheng was alone. A rare smile appeared on his face when he saw Sillin. You're here. Amen. Sillin looked at the equipment around him. Very good stuff. As expected of the C.I. family, the equipment they used was of the best quality. Even Hui Mao, who was a little picky after seeing the equipment Shimu and the others used, did not have a cheap mouth for once. How is it? Sillin asked as he looked at the data and molecular models on the screen. C.I. Jincheng rubbed his forehead. He looked a little tired. It had been days since he had rested well. The samples are incomplete, so it's very difficult to study further. While saying this, C.I. Jincheng operated on the screen for a bit and pointed at some of the information displayed on the screen. He said, they're all incomplete samples, and the preservation of the samples isn't good either. The information we can obtain from them is too limited, and the accuracy is far from what I want. We spent a lot of effort to obtain these samples, and the other research teams aren't any better than me. Sillin could understand C.I. Jincheng's troubles. Without good samples, it was very difficult to make any progress. They might not be able to obtain the results they wanted even if they continued researching day and night. Back then, Si Fong was very unyielding when he carried out the taper extermination operation. None of his subordinates kept any nightmare taper samples. All the nightmare taper samples that they knew and saw were destroyed. That was why they couldn't find a perfectly preserved nightmare taper sample in the army now. The samples that C.I. Jincheng had, and the samples that the other research teams had, were all collected during the past few years of encirclement and suppression of Miracle. Even splicing the information won't work? Sillin asked. No, those samples are all different. The viruses they carry and their tolerance are all different. Without knowing the parent, splicing the information will make the error even bigger. C.I. Jincheng picked up the cup next to him and gulped down a few mouthfuls of water. He was really exhausted during this period of time, but the results he obtained were really annoying. Is there any progress on Lung's side? Sillin asked. C.I. Jincheng shook his head. No, I don't think there's much progress. Before he finished, C.I. Jincheng received an emergency communication request. His communication here had gone through multiple layers of encryption and camouflage. Its confidentiality was very high, and it was very difficult for others to eavesdrop. Looking at the code on the communicator, C.I. Jincheng raised his eyebrows. I just mentioned this guy, and he's calling. C.I. Jincheng pressed the button to accept the call directly, and the light screen that popped up showed young Master Lung's usual slovenly appearance. The moment the call connected, young Master Lung made a fuss. Has Sillin gone to your side yet? I have an emergency. C.I. Jincheng looked at the person on the light screen who was yelling, I have an emergency, while swinging his feet and chewing on a watermelon. He silently adjusted his perspective so that Sillin was facing the light screen. Puffed. Lung was so excited that he spat out a mouthful of watermelon water. Quite a bit of it even went into his nose. Fuck, why didn't you guys tell me that Sillin is here? What's the emergency? Sillin did not waste words with him. There was no telling where this guy would go once he started talking. The young master wiped his mouth with his sleeve and threw away the watermelon skin carelessly. Lung said, I found some information regarding the sample that C.I. Jincheng mentioned. C.I. Jincheng was going to sit down at the side, but he immediately stopped when he heard Lung's words. He walked up and asked, You got it? I got it, but I get angry when I talk about it. Lung said angrily, That red-eyed one is seriously hard to please. I can't get a single fart out of him, no matter how much I try. Ever since young Master Lung locked the little old man Brizette outside the study, he had become a lot more at ease. The red-eyed one? Sillin was puzzled. That thug from Sector V. Oh, Blood-Eye Aiken. Sillin nodded. What does this have to do with him? This doesn't have much to do with him at first, but it does have something to do with his foster father. Lung explained. The foster father of the current leader of the Freedom Army, Aikenus, used to be one of the bigwigs of Sector V. However, after the bigwigs were killed one after another, and Sector V fell into complete chaos, Aikenus, as one of the man's many foster sons, seized the opportunity to rise to power. There are many reasons why the bigwigs of Sector V were killed one after another. One of them is that some of them are connected to miracles, and Aikenus' foster father is one of them. Also, he is one of the people who helped to preserve the sample. Lung's words were the most important piece of information. C.I. Jincheng could not help but grow excited. He was not afraid of not being able to get his hands on the sample. No matter how difficult it was, he had to find a way to get his hands on the sample. Otherwise, everything would be too late. No wonder it was so hard to clean up the sample back then. He didn't think that they would infiltrate Sector V. How laughable. Sector V almost became the Nightmare Taper's sacrifice, but in the end, they were the ones who helped to preserve these killing machines that almost took their lives. On the other hand, the reason why Si Fong couldn't find the remaining samples back then was definitely because of Osculos's interference. Otherwise, the people of Sector V might not have been able to keep the sample a secret with Si Fong's determination and methods back then. Lung continued to talk about the investigation this time. Through the unorthodox methods in his hands that could not see the light of day, he did manage to find a lot of useful information. Then, he dug deeper into the information and dug out Aikenus. The samples that were preserved back then were all taken back by miracles after the bigwigs of Sector V were killed one after another. However, they might not have really taken everything. Back then, those bigwigs had helped to preserve a box, and the Nightmare Taper sample was inside the box. However, they did not know that the box contained the thing that those bigwigs had spent a lot of money to preserve. However, one of the bigwigs opened the box by force. Once the box was opened, the item inside would spontaneously destroy itself upon contact with oxygen. Fortunately, there was an exception. One of the samples did not undergo oxidation and decomposition when it came into contact with air. At the time, Aikenus' foster father happened to be there, and after he killed the person, he secretly stored the sample away. He did not tell anyone about the sample, even in his death. I'm guessing that miracles didn't expect there to be an unexpected exception. That was why they did not suspect Icanthus's foster father after they saw the oxidation and decomposition scene. After cleaning up the people who helped to preserve the sample and retrieving the sample, miracles allowed Sector V to do whatever they wanted. So, you suspect that Acanthus has the sample? Scylla asked. Acanthus had taken over some of his foster father's things. In other words, he had forcefully seized some of his foster father's things. It was very likely that the Nightmare Taper's sample was among them. That is indeed the case. However, I've talked to Acanthus many times, but he refused to say anything. He wouldn't say that he has it, but he wouldn't say that he doesn't. I think that you have a good relationship with him. If you personally ask him about it, he might speak up. Lung's great young master was pretty depressed. The great Andrire family's current young master had lowered himself to talk to him in person, and Acanthus still gave him the cold shoulder. Chapter 404. The conversation between Acanthus and young master Lung wasn't as difficult to pry as young master Lung had claimed. In fact, the conversation was quite pleasant when it came to business and the cooperation between the Andrire family and the Freedom Army. But the moment the topic of miracle was brought up, the atmosphere turned cold. Acanthus kept his mouth shut. He refused to speak, no matter what benefits Lung promised him. However, when young Master Lung pulled Scylla's strings, Acanthus reacted. Acanthus, the man who didn't even bat an eyelid when the Food King was mentioned, had spoken up when Lung mentioned Scylla. It was why Lung had contacted CI Jincheng in a hurry. The 11th Squad didn't have Scylla's men at all, and Sector C's communication signal was special. Lung didn't dare to contact CI Jincheng carelessly unless there were special anti-eavesdropping devices like CI Jincheng's base. All right, I'll ask him later, but I can't guarantee that I'll be able to obtain information about the Nightmare Taper from him. Scylla emphasized the possibility first so that he wouldn't look forward to it in vain. I think, Lung rubbed his chin, that guy must know some secrets even if he doesn't have a sample of the Nightmare Taper. After ending the call with Lung, Scylla used CI Jincheng's communicator to contact Acanthus. Since Lung had informed Acanthus early in the morning, the call connected very quickly when Scylla tried to contact him. You guys really want that? Acanthus cut to the chase. He could guess a lot of things from his conversation with Lung. Yeah, we have to give it a try no matter what. Scylla answered. If it really does erupt, how many people do you think will survive? I can't say for sure. It'll be a disaster if it erupts. No one could avoid this disaster, not even Sector V. I do have that. I hope that you can help us as soon as possible when you find a solution, and not wait until the last moment to consider the people of Sector V. Since he owed Scylla a couple of favors, Acanthus was a little tactful when he said this, which was rare for him. If the person he was negotiating with was Lung, then Acanthus would definitely take a strong stance. Of course, it was already great news that Acanthus had a sample. Plus, there was no way Scylla would leave the Freedom Army alone. Right now, the Freedom Army was faintly showing signs of becoming the leader of Sector V. Acanthus would not let go of such a great situation unless it was absolutely necessary. For Scylla, this was a good thing. Acanthus didn't trust anyone else, so he insisted on going to the Freedom Army to get a sample. At first, Scylla was going to go there himself, but after some thought, he decided to send Cheto instead. Apart from Scylla, Cheto was the person who left the deepest impression on Acanthus. Moreover, Cheto was Scylla's most trusted subordinate. Therefore, Acanthus agreed to the arrangement after a moment of thought. All right, there's one more thing I want to tell you. The first time we met you, we were being chased, and the ones who were chasing us were the 6th Legion. The poison in Qing's body was produced by a miracle. When I was fleeing, I saw a person. That person was with the 6th Division at the time, and a long time ago, I saw him and my adoptive father talking. He was the one who gave the box to my adoptive father. He might be the one who took the box. Acanthus didn't say everything. He wasn't completely telling the truth. The one who recognized that person wasn't Acanthus himself, but Anna Qing. At the time, Acanthus didn't have the opportunity to come into close contact with those things, nor did he have the ability to do so. However, Qing could. Qing's concealment ability was pretty strong. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to act as Qing to this extent without being recognized. Scylla knew that there was more to this than meets the eye, but judging from Icanthus's expression, he knew that the man wasn't going to tell the truth. Therefore, he didn't pursue the matter further. "Do you have an image of that person?" Scylla asked. "No, but I do have his drawing." Acanthus brought up a scanned image of a drawing. "It's him. Maybe you can learn something from him." After memorizing the person's appearance on the image, Scylla said his thanks and ended the call after discussing with Acanthus about the sample. Inside C.I. Jinsheng's workshop, Scylla, Cheto, C.I. Jinsheng, and the lung in the image were discussing about the sample collection. After Cheto had gone over, Longwei arranged for someone to receive him and secretly send him to Sector V. Once there, Acanthus would take over. There was no way he would allow the Andryra family to infiltrate deep into the Freedom Army. While Scylla and the others were discussing, the bored Hui Mao had gone to the indoor forest to play. The environment inside the forest was very good, comparable to the natural environment of some rank A planets. Moreover, the species inside the forest had been carefully calculated and maintained in a relatively stable state. There was no way that an accident to a certain species would cause a break in this small food chain. At the training room, the floor was littered with people. Prisa was the only one standing in the entire training room. Right now, Prisa was not looking at the people lying on the ground. Instead, she was standing with her back to them and watching the image that popped up from a device in her hand. Knight rubbed his almost dislocated arm, climbed up, and staggered over. "What are you looking at, Senior?" Knight asked. In the past, Prisa would explain everything to them after training with them. But today, she did not say anything and went to the side to do her own thing. "That's right. What are you looking at, Senior?" Ruolin asked while rolling on the floor. They all addressed Prisa as Senior. It was a common form of address used by hunters, so they addressed her as such. They couldn't possibly call her Auntie like C.I. Jinsheng, could they? "You guys want to see?" Prisa turned around and looked at the group of people lying on the floor. "Yes." Everyone answered in unison. When Knight walked over, Prisa had covered the device, so she did not see it. Now that he heard Prisa's words, Knight immediately retreated and sat on the floor with Yu Lu and the others, waiting for Prisa's next move. Prisa opened the button-sized device in her palm, and an image popped up on the light screen. It was the ecological zone inside this base. At this moment, the field of view displayed on the light screen was a dense forest, all kinds of trees and shrubs, and artificial light was shining on this area like natural light. Some small insects were active, and a few butterflies were dancing among the flowers. Everyone looked at the scene on the screen in confusion, so they looked at Prisa in confusion. Prisa pointed a finger at one of the corners, and the image zoomed in. The group of people stared at the image with wide eyes. They waited, but there was nothing. They waited again, but there was nothing. Just as Knight was about to speak, a shadow suddenly flashed across the image. It was so fast that it was hard to catch. If everyone wasn't staring at the image closely, they might not have noticed it. "That's..." The corner of Knight's eye twitched. "That fat cat." On the image, Hui Mao flashed quickly like a ghost. One moment it was next to a parasol tree. The next it was crouching behind shrub. When everyone saw this, they all had the same thought in their minds. How did it do that with its size? Hui Mao was crouching. The pupils of its round eyes dilated as it stared in a certain direction. The movement of its paw was so quiet that even the people next to it might not be able to hear it. Hui Mao's ears turned, and then turned to look in a certain direction. There were some hidden surveillance devices there, and the image Prisa released was taken by one of them. "What a vigilant little guy." Prisa smiled. "Senior, you mean it noticed us looking at it?" Knight asked. "Yes." On the image, Hui Mao looked in their direction. The corners of his mouth curled up, and then returned to its previous state, moving stealthily in the direction of its destination. "I can't help but feel that there's something strange about this cat." Roland scratched his arm and said, "What's that guy doing?" Feng Haichao followed Hui Mao's line of sight, but saw nothing. Knight and the others thought the same. Their eyes hurt from watching, but they didn't see anything. "Can't not see?" Knight mumbled. As soon as Knight finished speaking, Everyone froze at the same time, thinking of a certain guy. It can't be. In the next moment, Hui Mao pounced towards a branch on a large tree like lightning. Then a sharp scream rang. It really is that guy. Hurry up and call C.I. Jincheng, or else his long-eared owl is going to end up in the cat's stomach. C.I. Jincheng had a pet, a long-eared owl. This guy was usually the leader of this ecological zone, and often showed off its feathers that were different from normal long-eared owls. It also had a cheap mouth, and sometimes Yulu wanted nothing more than to take a gun and give it an unforgettable lesson. Not only could this long-eared owl speak, it was also very intelligent. After all, it was trained by C.I. Jincheng, so it had mastered many of its skills very well. It had once used C.I. Jincheng's microcomputer to hack a section of an electronic magazine. Other than that, it could also turn invisible. Normally, it would use its invisible state when resting in a tree, and it would be very difficult to discover this guy without some special equipment. In the past, this long-eared owl had played many pranks on people, but now, this always cocky guy was being slapped from the air by cat claw after cat claw, rolling a few times on the grass. When it finally managed to fly up again, it would be slapped down again. Hui Mao was stretching its gray wings and playfully slapping this long-eared owl until it cried out loudly. When it cried out, it even scolded Hui Mao in a few sector languages. Every time it scolded Hui Mao, it would slap him a little harder. In the end, one of the two ear tufts on this long-eared owl's head that it was so proud it was almost chewed off. It looked like it was missing a piece. When C.I. Jincheng rushed over, the scene he saw was his pet being pressed to the ground by the fat cat, howling and scolding loudly. "If you keep scolding me, I'll pluck one of your feathers for every word you say. Do you think I don't understand sector languages?" Hui Mao pressed that long-eared owl down with its claws and wagged its tail. The moment Silin saw Hui Mao like this, he knew that this fat cat was about to get carried away again. He ran over and lifted Hui Mao up. "Didn't I tell you not to bully others?" Silin flicked Hui Mao's ear. Hui Mao moved its claws and shook off the feathers between its claws. "I'm not bullying anyone, I'm bullying a bird." C.I. Jincheng looked at the long-eared owl that was flapping its wings as it ran over and smiled. "Still showing off?" Hearing C.I. Jincheng's words, the long-eared owl cried even louder and vented its grievances with all its might. It even moved its ear tufts to show C.I. Jincheng its pitiful ear feathers. C.I. Jincheng's long-eared owl was called Ghost Claw because it had a pair of extremely sharp claws. However, its claws couldn't do anything to Hui Mao in the clash just now. Even the rescue signal it had sent out had been intercepted. This was also the reason why C.I. Jincheng had only come over after it had been tortured for such a long time. Because all the signals it sent to C.I. Jincheng had been intercepted, it had no choice but to first send a signal to another location before redirecting the distress signal. Prisa didn't let Night and the others show up. She only informed C.I. Jincheng. After that, they all watched the scene displayed on the screen and saw with their own eyes how that fat cat bullied Ghost Claw. C.I. Jincheng wasn't angry about Ghost Claw's misfortune. Ghost Claw was too proud of himself and needed to be polished a little. Also, that cat had obviously shown mercy with its claws. Otherwise, with his abilities, it would have cut Ghost Claw into pieces with a single swipe of its claws. Inside the training room, the few people laughed and discussed about Ghost Claw. How satisfying. That guy really should be taught a lesson. He often bullied them because they didn't understand some of the native languages of other sectors, so he would change his ways to scold them. This time, he was at a disadvantage. How satisfying. I've long heard that cats and birds can't get along, but now I've seen it for myself. Feng Haichao said, "You're wrong. That cat is establishing its dominance." Prisa put away the instrument in her hand and turned to look at the few people. Establishing its dominance? Oh, I get it. The ecological zone is Ghost Claw's territory, and that cat knows that Ghost Claw is the leader of that territory. That's why it attacked Ghost Claw. That way, it would become the new leader of the ecological zone. A typical battle between beasts. Ruo Lin felt that he had seen the essence. No, its goal isn't to take over the ecological zone's territory. It attacked Ghost Claw to establish its dominance. Actually, it's establishing its dominance for you to see. Priestess said, establishing its dominance for us to see? Why? Everyone suddenly remembered the creepy smile that the cat revealed when it looked at the screen just now. On the other side, Hui Mao, who had been dragged back by Sillin, was slowly licking his claws. On the table beside him stood Ghost Claw, whose feathers had been plucked quite a bit. Now Ghost Claw was much more well-behaved. He didn't use the languages of other sectors to make a fool of himself, and just stood there pitifully. After C.I. Jinsheng combed Ghost Claw's feathers and calmed him down, he had Ghost Claw return to the ecological zone. Although Ghost Claw looked like it was tortured badly, there weren't any wounds. Hui Mao had great control when he swung his claws. Cheto once told him that teaching someone a lesson was a technical job. Hui Mao had learned a bit of a technical job. Cheto had already departed, and C.I. Jinsheng would help him leave Sector C in secret. Sillin believed that Cheto would be able to handle the rest well. Glar is in the 6th Corps right now. However, there is very little information about him, and we can't get hold of him for now. The only thing we know is that he holds an important position in the 6th Corps. C.I. Jinsheng pointed at the image and the few lines of information displayed on the screen and said, Glar was the person Alkinthus mentioned, and after C.I. Jinsheng received the appearance from Sillin, he couldn't find much information about this person through many channels. This further proved that there was something strange about this person. If he came into contact with Alkinthus' foster father regarding the nightmare taper sample, then I can't think of a possibility. C.I. Jinsheng said. Spy. Sillin also thought of the term. That's right. After Miracle's supporters fell one after another and changed their stance, the legions who supported Miracle in the past are now ruthless as well. They are no less merciful than the others. Right now, the 6th Corps can be considered as a representative of those who are trying to eliminate Miracle. In the past, the 6th Corps and Miracle had a lot of cooperation, but this time, the 6th Corps attacked swiftly and destroyed a few Miracle's bases as soon as the wind changed. There were some things that Sillin understood, even if C.I. Jinsheng didn't say it out loud. The reason why the legions were fighting against each other wasn't necessarily to eliminate a scourge like Miracle. It was more to obtain some precious things from Miracle in advance. For example, the Nightmare Taper. Glar was probably a spy sent by the 6th Corps commander, Kikila. This chess piece was buried very early on, which was why Kikila was able to come into contact with the transfer mission of the Nightmare Taper sample. We can't say for sure if the 6th Corps has successfully activated the main body of the Nightmare Taper, C.I. Jinsheng said. Although the news they received was that none of the 8 legions had managed to activate the main body of the Nightmare Taper, C.I. Jinsheng was still suspicious when he found out about Glar. It was just a suspicion, though. The chances of one of the 8 great marshals, the 6th Corps' commander Kikila, possessing the main body of the Nightmare Taper was not high. Sillin refused to believe that the 6th Legion wasn't the only one who had planted their own pawns inside Miracle. Perhaps these pawns had been exposed by now, or perhaps they hadn't come into contact with that level of secret at all. If that was the case, then all 8 legions were suspects? No. Judging from the current performance of the legions, it didn't look like they had obtained the main body of the Nightmare Taper. Suspicions aside, they were still prepared to go inside the 6th Corps and take a look. This is the place where Glar often appears. C.I. Jinsheng drew a circle on the star map. This was the information he had obtained after using a lot of methods, but it was only this bit of information. It wasn't complete, and they would have to investigate the rest themselves. Can't we filter its nature through the communication network? Sillin asked. No. Every legion in Sector C has a special protection network. The closer you are to the legion's core area, the greater the restriction. This area is close to the 6th Corps' headquarters, C.I. Jinsheng explained. Then we can only go there first and filter. We should be able to know the distribution of the various bases there after we enter. That's the only way. C.I. Jinsheng began to investigate all kinds of recent information about the 6th Corps in search of the best way to enter. In the end, C.I. Jinsheng chose a route and formulated a plan of action with the others. Prisa wouldn't participate in this operation. After all, Her identity was too sensitive, and according to the rules, she couldn't interfere directly. If she was discovered, some people would take the opportunity to cause trouble instead. Chapter 405. On a planet under the jurisdiction of the 6th Legion at Sector C, there were busy soldiers and transport robots everywhere. This planet was a transit planet. Some of the 6th Legion's goods would be transported from this planet to various places. It was because of this planet's nature. What followed was an increasingly strict inspection process. The goods on every transport line had to go through several rounds of inspection, and an alarm would be raised if there was even the slightest suspicious change. The inspection of the transport lines heading to the Legion's core areas was even stricter, and they would only be transported to the transport planes after multiple scans. Right now, a few large boxes were being dragged by the transport robots to a specific transport plane. These transport robots followed a specific route, and within this specific route, there would be a scanner that would perform several rounds of scanning and testing on the boxes they were dragging. The distance from the exit of the warehouse to the transport plane was less than 200 meters, but it had been scanned 5 times. This batch of goods were all medicinal goods, and the medicine inspection had been done when the boxes were packed. These few rounds of inspection were mainly to check if there were dangerous items, spy monitoring devices, abnormal conditions, and so on. After the transport robots had placed the large boxes into the transport plane's cargo hold, they turned around and continued to move the other boxes. 2 hours later, all the boxes that needed to be moved up had been moved. In reality, these transport robots could have moved the boxes in less than half an hour, but it was because of the extra 5 rounds of inspection that the time taken was several times longer. Still, the people of the 6th Legion had no complaints about this. The more times they were scanned, the safer it was, and they could rest assured. All right, that's all for this batch of goods. I'll leave the rest to you. The person guarding the warehouse said to the transport soldiers. After the handover and registration was done, the 3 pilots and 20 or so guards boarded the plane and prepared to leave. The transport plane slowly drove from the runway at the warehouse to the port. To leave the planet, it had to depart from a specific flight field at the port. There, it would undergo a few more inspections and identity verification of the people inside the plane. After many verifications, the transport plane finally took to the sky. Its next destination was a planet at the 6th Legion's core area. While the transport plane was flying towards the target planet, 3 boxes inside the cargo hold opened quietly. "I'm suffocating," Knight said. A few people came out of the 3 boxes one after another. There were 3 people hidden in each box. When they were hiding in the boxes, they relied on breathing masks to maintain their cover. However, in order to prevent being detected during the test, they had to hold their breaths for a long time during the test. If they hadn't been trained, they would probably have suffocated to death. After coming out, the few of them took a deep breath of air. After all, the inside of the box was narrow and stuffy. Even the breathing masks were suffocating. This time, there were 9 people who had come, so it wasn't appropriate for more to come. Those who couldn't come overstayed on the planet with Prisa to guard the base and were trained by Prisa. In the plan that CI, Jinsheng, and Silin had come up with, they would first infiltrate the cargo transfer planet and start with the cargo. This was the only place where they could take advantage of the situation. Before the carrier reached the core area but did not enter the target planet, they needed to find the planet Grayer was on. Time was still very tight. If they followed the carrier to the destination planet, it would be very difficult for the 9 of them to escape. Silin patted Hui Mao, who was looking left and right and nodded at the boxes with his chin. In the next moment, Hui Mao walked next to the boxes, opened his mouth, and spat out the medical materials he had swallowed. They couldn't use the subspace here. Originally, CI Jinsheng was going to open the other boxes and fish out the materials from them to fill up these 3 boxes. But in the end, Hui Mao volunteered to help solve this problem. Also, CI Jinsheng's equipment didn't detect anything after he swallowed some things during the pretest. Hui Mao could still swallow things freely under the conditions of the non-subspace, and strangely enough, there was no suspicious mucus on those items. Weirdo. This was everyone's evaluation of Hui Mao. Because of this, Ghost Claw couldn't raise his head in front of Hui Mao with confidence. He became weak the moment he saw Hui Mao. Hui Mao wagged his tail proudly and looked at Ghost Claw, who was standing next to Ci Jinsheng, pretending to observe other places. He thought to himself, I really don't know why they brought this burden here. After packing the items and putting the boxes back together, Ci Jinsheng and Silin began their search. Through the intercepted information, they analyzed the properties of some planets and deduced the planet Grayer might appear on. Hui Mao helped intercept the information. He didn't need to use any other equipment. All he had to do was crouch there and lick his claws while collecting information. Next to Ci Jinsheng, Ghost Claw stood on a special equipment and jumped around while using his claws to input some information. Sometimes he used both his claws and mouth at the same time. He maintained a small spread of his wings to stabilize his body. Night, Yu Lu and the others were resting and conserving their energy. Looking at the jumping Ghost Claw and Hui Mao, who was squinting his eyes like he was asleep, but would occasionally input some information, Night sighed and said, Sometimes I feel like these animals are more intelligent than humans. It was true. It was hard to imagine how a seemingly normal animal could be so capable. The sensor equipment inside the cargo hold had been dealt with a long time ago, so they weren't afraid of being discovered. Normally speaking, no one would come to check before they arrived at the transport point. Knight looked at the time. This transport plane would soon leave warp mode. After leaving warp mode, Silin and the others would only have a minute at most to carry out the final analysis. Soon, Ci Jinsheng said in a comforting tone. He and Silin had already narrowed down the range by a lot. After the transport plane left warp mode, they would only need 15 seconds at most to carry out the confirmation. Knight silently counted the time. His estimation of time was very accurate. After the transport plane left warp mode, he counted another 12 seconds. Just as he finished counting to 12 seconds, Silin said, Found it. This sentence was like an action command. The moment he finished, Silin and Ci Jinsheng began to quickly pack up the instruments in their hands. Knight and the others had already activated their special protective suits. After a hand gesture, the cargo hold door opened and Knight led the way out. They already knew the layout of this transport plane like the back of their hands. While waiting for Silin and Ci Jinsheng's confirmation, they began to rehearse their next move in their minds. Right now, they were merely repeating the rehearsal in their minds. There was a hatch near the cargo hold. This was a hatch used specifically when transporting cargo. When Knight and the others approached the cabin door automatically opened. This was Ci Jinsheng's doing. They had 3 seconds to blind the carrier aircraft's defense network, and no one else on the carrier aircraft would know about this blinding. The 9 of them jumped out one after another. They turned invisible when they jumped out, which also allowed them to hide from radar and scanning equipment. Hui Mao hooked Silin's arm with its tail. It did not spread its wings, too lazy to move. On the other hand, Ghost Claw flew out without any space protective equipment after wearing a special breathing mask. However, it could directly turn invisible because of its own body. That guy isn't that useless after all. Hui Mao looked at Ghost Claw that was gripping Ci Jinsheng's shoulder tightly and muttered. There were very few animals that could fly in space without any protection. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why Ci Jinsheng brought Ghost Claw with him. After confirming the planet, they flew slowly in that direction. Although they said it was slow, it was only relative to the transport plane and other tools. After all, the propellers on the protective suits were limited. The 6th Legion's patrol fleet would appear every now and then. Every time that happened, Silin and the others would stop and wait for the patrol fleet to pass before continuing their flight. The good thing was that there were no asteroid belts around, and there weren't many space objects floating in space. This area should have been cleaned frequently. We can't continue like this, Knight said as he watched another patrol fleet pass by. Silin looked at Hui Mao, who was lying on his arm, as if he didn't hear Knight at all. He poked him and said, It's time to shine. Silin understood Hui Mao's thoughts very well. However, before this, it was indeed inadvisable to make too big of a move when the situation wasn't clear. Now that they knew the patrol fleet's general patrolling area, direction, and time, they could speed up. Hui Mao's ears turned, and he raised his head to look at the few people who were advancing at a turtle's pace. He grinned and said through the internal comms, "Fine, you guys are so pitiful. I'll help you guys." Hui Mao didn't transform into his mighty form. Changing his form randomly could cause magnetic fluctuations which would be noticed by some of the long-range detectors on the planet. Hui Mao was aware of this. Sillin had the others take out their ropes. One end was held by Hui Mao, and the other end was tied to themselves. "This will do." Hui Mao grabbed the rope and began to speed up. With Hui Mao's help, their speed was indeed much faster. They only slowed down when they were close to the confirmed planet. Inside the planet surveillance station, the technicians were staring at the big screens in front of them. "Is there anything unusual today?" Someone walked in from outside and asked. "Nothing up until now. Other than the few patrols that passed by, there are no other abnormalities." "Amen. Don't let your guard down." "Yes." While the technicians answered yes confidently, 9 people had already sneaked through the external defense network and entered the planet. The 9 of them acted according to the plan they had discussed earlier and snuck into this enormous research base. The research base was under the banner of military use, but the research inside might not be exposed to the public. Even the people of the 6th Army only knew some things on the surface. They didn't know anything deeper, such as some research that had been banned by the League of Stars a long time ago. Sillin, C.I. Jincheng, and Feng Haichao were in a group. In terms of shooting, Feng Haichao was not as good as Yu Lu. He was similar to Yu Lu in terms of stealth too. However, Feng Haichao was good in other aspects. This guy could hang upside down from the ceiling for a few hours without using any tools. Ghost Claw did not follow them into the base. He stayed in the sky outside the base and reported what he saw and the information he could intercept to C.I. Jincheng. They did not use the common language of the League of Stars when they talked to each other. Instead, they used a small language that no one knew which corner of the League of Stars was from. Even if they used a small language, C.I. Jincheng still used some coded words when he was talking to Ghost Claw. If C.I. Jincheng did not explain, even if the people could understand the small language, they would not know what C.I. Jincheng was trying to express. Sillin and the other 2 hid in a corner of the base and did not go in recklessly. C.I. Jincheng looked at the information he had collected. There was no clear mention of nightmare taper in the information he had stolen. However, there were some codes in the core experimental information that C.I. Jincheng found suspicious. He circled 3 rune combinations and said to Sillin, "One of these 3 rune combinations might refer to the nightmare taper." Sillin looked at the 3 rune combinations that C.I. Jincheng circled and pointed at one of them. He said, "What information is there about this rune combination? I've seen this combination before. It should refer to something very confidential." The thing that this rune combination refers to is over at the 3rd zone of the base. However, the 3rd zone doesn't take up a big area in this base. The area was related to the degree of importance. The 3rd zone of the base did not take up a big area. This also meant that the project that was being carried out in this zone was not what the main person in charge, Glare, valued. However, Glare stayed in the 3rd zone the longest. Something was wrong. There was definitely something wrong with the 3rd zone. Correspondingly, there were a lot of access control devices around the 3rd zone. Both C.I., Jincheng, and Sillin had their ways to get in, but they did not dare to go in recklessly if Glare was there. "Should we ask Knight and the others to cause some commotion over at the 7th zone and attract Glare there?" C.I. Jincheng asked. Knight's operation team was very close to the 7th zone, and the 7th zone was a bit far away from the 3rd zone. If Glare went there, it would give them some time to investigate the problem at the 3rd zone. "No, don't let Knight and the others do anything first." Sillin looked at the information C.I. Jincheng had compiled. The 7th zone was indeed a bit far from the 3rd zone, but it was a problem to do something there without being discovered. Although C.I. Jincheng had actually given Knight and the others some medicine and tools that could successfully cause certain things to happen at the experimental area, this wasn't the best outcome. Moreover, Glare might not necessarily go there himself. Instead, he might directly lock down that area, because that was where the virus experiments were being conducted there. After looking at the current information and the general layout of the base, Sillin pointed at the 8th zone and said, "It'll be better if we start from here." The 8th zone's progress was related to biochemical beasts. It was an experimental project that this planet was using as a cover. Every military had such experimental projects, and there was no need to hide them. The 8th zone took up a larger area, at least on the surface. If there was a problem with the project on the surface, Blair would go over and take a look even if he had to put on an act. It was to show how important this project was to the researchers and appease them. Sillin did not think that everyone in this base knew about the dream taper. There must be a very small number of people here who knew about the dream taper. Only those who were truly involved in the core research of the dream taper knew the true purpose of this base's existence. From the looks of it, the researchers in the other experimental zones definitely did not know about the actual situation. C.I. Jinsheng understood Sillin's thoughts when Sillin pointed it out. This is a better target, but the problem is that the others are not close to the 8th zone. The further they were, the higher the possibility of being exposed. This was a higher risk. Sillin turned to look at Hui Mao, who was moving its claws on his shoulder, itching to try. He pointed at it and said to C.I. Jinsheng, "Just leave it to it." Feng Haichao, who had not interjected all this while, looked at this fat cat suspiciously. He had a feeling that it was unreliable. With this cat's personality, who knew what kind of trouble it would cause? It was obvious that Feng Haichao did not know Hui Mao very well. Hui Mao might look unreliable normally, but it was still very capable when it came to serious matters. After some thought, C.I. Jinsheng agreed and informed the others about what might happen next. To prevent Hui Mao from playing too much, Sillin had purposely pinched one of the cat's ears and reminded it. 40 minutes later, some trouble appeared at the 8th zone. It was said that something had gone wrong with the experiment. This kind of situation was more common in experiments like this. So, the people in the other experimental zones were not surprised and ignored it. They were not in the mood to pay attention to the different experimental teams. At most, they would talk about it when they were bored. At the 8th zone, after some experimental animals were captured from the supervision room and injected with drugs, the experimenters would place them in some special cages. There were some test boards on both sides of the cages, and some images would be projected on the test boards to stimulate these animals who had been injected with drugs. When they saw something they did not like, these experimental animals would reach out their claws and scratch the test board hard. The test boards would then perform a series of analysis on the depth, width, and trajectory of the scratches. Originally, the theoretical effect of the drug that had just been injected was very satisfactory. But now, it was unknown if the animals in the cages were terrified or had other thoughts. In short, their emotions were abnormal. Starting from the leopard in the middle, this anxiety spread. The test boards were quickly scratched, and the reflected data was arranged into a series of charts by the computer and displayed on the screens in front of the experimenters. The abnormal data caused the experimenters at the 8th zone to panic. Meanwhile, over at the 3rd zone, "Leader, there's a problem with the biochemical beast project. Right now, the experimenters over there can't control the emotions of the experimental animals at all. This goes against the theory." In other words, it failed again? Glyer said slowly from his chair. No emotion could be heard from his voice. Yes, that's right. The person standing in front of Glyer was sweating on his forehead. He did not know what was going on over there. Moreover, similar situations were common in experiments like this, but he felt a lot of pressure when facing Glyer. Glyer sighed mockingly and stood up. "Let's go take a look, lest they report to the higher-ups that I'm neglecting them again." The mission was a success. Hui Mao squatted in a corner and watched the reactions of these people proudly. It didn't actually do anything, it just farted at the experimental animals in the cages. Then the experimental animals started to go crazy. Chapter 406. While Hui Mao was driving those experimental animals crazy, other than the people who came over to report to Glar, there were also a few communication requests from Glar. It was probably the project manager of the experimental zone who came over to complain again. Glar knew what they were going to ask for next, even if he didn't listen to them. Glar actually didn't care about the project over there at all. As one of the very few people who knew the truth about the existence of this experimental base, he naturally knew very well what it was. The 8th experimental zone was a cover. Just as Scylla had guessed, Glar's reaction after hearing that the experimental zone had failed again was enough to confirm that he didn't care about those things from Glar's current expression and indifferent actions. The fact that Glar was in charge of the 3rd experimental zone was just a facade. On the surface, Glar was the vice team leader of the 3rd experimental zone and the overall person in charge of the entire experimental base. When the other project team leaders looked down on Glar, this useless paratrooper, behind their backs, did Glar ever look them in the eye? Glar took out a few documents. He would do something he thought was more meaningful when he was listening to those boring old fellows discuss boring topics later. He still had a lot of experimental data in his hands that he hadn't analyzed yet. He didn't have the time to listen to those trashes boasting. What Glar didn't know was that 3 people had snuck into this experimental zone that didn't take up much space and wasn't valued on the surface right after he left the 3rd experimental zone. Feng Haichao was powerful. There were a few times when he floated right over the heads of some researchers who were rushing in and out of the lab without being discovered. When it came to stealth, C.I. Jincheng was slightly weaker than Scylla and Feng Haichao. However, the technology he possessed made up for this weakness. C.I. Jincheng could always find some small equipment on him to help him get through any difficulties. There were a lot of entrances to this experimental zone, but they were prepared beforehand. Adding on to the fact that there weren't that many workers on the surface, Scylla and the others quickly advanced into the 3rd experimental zone. There were many times when machines could increase efficiency and provide an absolute advantage in many aspects, but these were rigid machines after all. Some of the verification measures on the entrances had been cleverly broken by Scylla and C.I. Jincheng. 20 minutes. Scylla gestured towards C.I. Jincheng and Feng Haichao. This was the result of Hui Mao's estimation based on the situation on the other side. The exact time should not be too far off. As long as there were no accidents, Scylla and the rest had 20 minutes to explore the secrets of the 3rd experimental zone. Glayer would not leave this research area for too long. From the current information, other than the high-level meetings in this research base, other small meetings and unexpected matters would not take more than an hour. After that, Glayer would quickly return to the 3rd research area. This also meant that there was some kind of experiment going on in the 3rd experimental region, and Glayer couldn't leave for too long. How is it? Scylla combined the information he had gathered with the information C.I. Jincheng had gathered. Feng Haichao stood guard outside. If someone came over, he would give a warning. There's something wrong with this room. C.I. Jincheng pointed at a place on the detailed distribution map they had pieced together. It was Glayer's office. Let's go and take a look. Scylla sensed a lot of unusual machine language around him. These machine languages were invisible to normal people. Only Cheto and Hui Mao could see them. The place that C.I. Jincheng was pointing at, which was Glayer's office, obviously had more mechanical speech frequencies that did not match with the surroundings than other places. There were no soldiers guarding outside Glayer's office. In fact, there were basically no guards inside this base, especially the core area of the experiment. The soldiers were stationed at the periphery or in separate areas. Inside the laboratory, there were more machines and scanners than anything else. There was no AI system here. It was unknown whether it was because Glayer didn't trust AI systems or they couldn't create a trustworthy AI system. In short, this enormous base did not have an overall AI control center. Control was still in the hands of humans. This was good news for Scylla. AI systems were much harder to deal with than other systems, and without such a control center, it only took Scylla and Cheto half a minute to enter Glayer's office. Although cracking the password to Glayer's office in half a minute was already inconceivable to many people, they had already spent 1/40th of their time within the time limit. Including the time they used to come here, they only had 18 minutes and 26 seconds left. Glayer had protected this place very well. Without his personal permission, he would never allow anyone to enter. After they entered, Feng Haichao and C.I. Jincheng began searching for some important information and secrets in this place. The equipment C.I. Jincheng carried couldn't display the situation in this place, and he couldn't discover the secrets hidden here. This office was protected by a very complicated defense net. It was possible to crack it, but Glayer would probably be back by the time C.I. Jinsheng cracked it. Silin, what do we do? C.I. Jinsheng turned around and was about to ask Silin when he noticed that Silin had walked next to Glayer's chair. After looking around, Silin found a button on his handlebar and pressed it. A light screen popped up. Password? C.I. Jinsheng was familiar with this. He had more contact with some of the equipment in the military, so he knew about them. He quickly cracked the password. After he keyed in the password, a hole opened up in the floor, and the chair sank. Silin, C.I. Jinsheng, and Feng Haichao jumped down one after another and stacked on top of each other. Silin sat on the chair, C.I. Jinsheng stepped on Silin's shoulders, and Feng Haichao stepped on C.I. Jinsheng's shoulders. After all, this place was limited. Beneath this research base, there was a secret underground laboratory. This laboratory was very well hidden, and there were only 12 researchers here. However, all 12 of them were the most outstanding researchers in the 6th Division in this field, and they were all trustworthy. Those who did not trust them would be forced to come over through forceful means. 2 of the older ones had influence in this field that was comparable to Mo Heng's influence in mechanical engineering. It was obvious how much effort the 6th Army had put into this secret research. This underground laboratory was almost completely sealed off. These 12 researchers ate, drank, defecated, and slept here. If they wanted to leave, they would have to complete this research. Of course, Silin wasn't optimistic about what the 6th Army would do to them after they were done. Although some of them were forced to do it, most of them did it willingly. They were very interested in this. When Glayer and the 6th Army's commander, Kikila, told them this news, they had been conducting this research with a fanatical attitude. They didn't think that the thing that was rumored to have been wiped out 20 years ago was still here. It really is the nightmare taper. Although he didn't see a sample of the nightmare taper, C.I. Jinsheng was sure that this place was researching the nightmare taper from some data and analysis diagrams. After all, he had analyzed similar data for a long time. They're trying to activate a nightmare taper. Silin also noticed something. Apart from being perfectly preserved, the nightmare taper that he could try to activate was rather healthy as well. They're 55% done with the activation. If they're given a little more time, I'm afraid they'll be the second to complete the activation. C.I. Jinsheng frowned as he looked at the information he stole. They found a corner to hide after coming out from where the chair landed and began stealing the information. The amount of information they obtained was huge. The research here was progressing quickly. It was all thanks to Glayer. If he didn't infiltrate the core of Miracle directly, he definitely wouldn't have obtained this information and a complete and healthy nightmare taper. However, there's part of the information that we can't steal unless we're close enough to get the information from the devices. C.I. Jinsheng was troubled. Time was tight, and he had no better way to get the information. However, they couldn't get close to the place themselves. The core laboratory definitely had the sample and the most important information. It was indeed worrying that they couldn't go there despite knowing that. It was because there were garbugs there. There were some tiny bugs on the wall of the tunnel leading to the core laboratory. These bugs had a sharp sense of smell. They could identify changes in the environment based on the changes in the smell in the environment. These garbugs were specially designed to deal with strangers. Even if they could avoid the mechanical alarms, it would be hard to fool these extremely sharp guard bugs. The smell signal could be transmitted to their brains faster, and the abnormal signal was quickly transmitted to the light plates they were attached to. Once a stranger went there and was discovered by the guard bugs, a beam of light would cut the intruder into pieces. I'll go. After Silin finished speaking, a layer of black armor covered his body. Then, the armor disappeared. Silin, who was wrapped in the armor, disappeared as well. He was invisible, and it was a different kind of invisible. At least C.I. Jinsheng, who was next to him, couldn't detect him with the device. Silin followed a researcher who came out to relieve himself. The guards didn't notice Silin. This made C.I. Jinsheng and Feng Haichao let out a sigh of relief. But then, they became nervous. They didn't know where Silin was now. Did he start passing through the tunnel that the garbugs were attached to? After Silin entered this busy area, he walked towards the core laboratory. He was also observing the laboratory. This place took up a very large area. There were several large laboratories, and each laboratory had their own job. They were busy with the part they needed to decipher. Other than the complete specimen that was currently being activated, there were also some incomplete specimens similar to the ones in C.I. Jincheng's hands. However, it was obviously much easier for them to attack the parts after understanding the whole specimen. Looking at the emotions shown by the researchers wearing sterile clothes through their eye masks, Silin knew that their research was progressing smoothly. The large laboratories were all busy, and there were even some mechanical assistants helping them. However, there was no one at the core laboratory. Probably only Glyer could go there. When he stepped into the tunnel that led to the core laboratory, Silin's footsteps slowed down. He observed the reaction of the garbugs. Silin was careful with every step he took. Although he believed that the armor could cover his entire body, that even normal dead cells wouldn't fall here, and that his scent would be sealed, no one knew if there would be an accident, even if the possibility of an accident like this was only 1 in 100,000. As Silin moved slowly on this side, C.I. Jincheng and Feng Haitsao's hearts were in their throats. They were ready to act in the event of an emergency. However, as the seconds passed, there were no abnormalities or alarms. Right now, Silin must be in the tunnel. The fact that the guard bugs didn't give off any alarms meant that Silin's method was working. On the other hand, Feng Haichao was puzzled. Why would Silin have such a high-level item? How did Silin have something that even the military might not have? He was just a hunter. Didn't a hunter's techniques all be bought with money? Right now, Silin didn't care what other people thought. He was already close to the area where the guard bugs were distributed. The best range of detection for the guard bugs was the entrance that Silin had come from. However, even though Silin had walked for such a long time in the best range of detection, it was inevitable that his nerves would be highly tensed when he came into close contact with these guard bugs. 1 step, 2 steps, Silin slowly moved from 3 meters away from the guard bugs to 2 meters, 1 meter, and then to a few centimeters away. When he was at the closest distance, the guard bugs still didn't react. This made Silin let out a sigh of relief. However, when he looked at the guard bugs, Silin felt a little strange. He couldn't tell why, but he just felt that something was wrong. After passing through the area where the guard bugs were, Silin arrived at the entrance of the core laboratory. He greeted C.I. Jincheng and entered the laboratory when no one was paying attention to him. In the laboratory, the most eye-catching thing was the 2-meter-tall, cylindrical nutrition tank that was filled with liquid. There was a tiny thing inside the nutrition tank. It was impossible to see it if one didn't look closely. However, there were all kinds of tubes connected to external instruments and an activator that was shrunk all over the place where the tiny thing stayed. Bubbles would form and float up from time to time. That tiny thing was the nightmare taper. Hundreds of deadly viruses had been implanted into this tiny thing, and there might be even more that could be implanted after it was activated. This tiny thing was like a terrifying virus source. It could carry these extremely dangerous, deadly viruses to a certain place and release them. This was just one nightmare taper that was not fully activated, so it would not be lethal. However, it was said that Miracle had successfully activated a mother and cultivated this mother to split into more nightmare tapers, which then continued to split. An activated nightmare taper was terrifying enough. One could only imagine what would happen if all the nightmare tapers mobilized and released the viruses at the same time in all the sectors of the League of Stars. There was something scarier than viruses in this world. There is actually a living thing that could withstand so many deadly viruses at the same time without being affected. No wonder Communidin would affirm the importance of parasites back then. Communidin might have discovered similar parasites back then, but those parasites were not as terrifying as the nightmare taper. No. The nightmare taper back then was also modified. After modification and targeted breeding, it became the nightmare taper today. So, what kind of parasite did Communidin see back then? Could it be the original nightmare taper's embryonic form? Or was it some close relative? Silin had a great memory. He could clearly remember the documents that he had read. However, Sillin did not remember seeing anything similar in the information. There was nothing similar in Communidin's diary and other related records. Sillin squinted. Perhaps some people were not telling the truth and did not take out everything that belonged to Communidin. The device in his hand indicated that Sillin had copied all the information on the device. It had been 14 minutes until now. He had to leave as soon as possible. Sillin erased some of his traces and ensured that he wouldn't be discovered by glare. Then he began to retreat. Sillin was still on high alert as he retreated. He would not let his guard down just because he had avoided the bug guards. It was always good to be more alert. When he finally returned to C.I. Jincheng and Feng Haicao's hiding spot, Sillin passed the device to copy the information to C.I. Jincheng. This action caused Feng Haicao's trust in Sillin to grow a little higher, because Sillin did not have the slightest intention of keeping it for himself. He handed the device to C.I. Jincheng without hesitation. In reality, Feng Haichao did not know that Sillin had already read the information copied in the device a long time ago. However, he did not read it directly from this device. Instead, he read it from the devices in the lab. After obtaining the information they wanted, the trio quickly retreated. The trio was very careful not to leave any traces or scents on the chairs. Even if there were traces of someone sitting on the seats, they were restored to their original state. It had been exactly 20 minutes when they left the third lab area. Now that they were done with what they had to do, Sillin called Hui Mao back. While Weiss was retreating, it actually caused Glare to suffer a little. It had tampered with a mechanical sampler a little, and when Glare was passing through it, one of the sampler's supporting arms suddenly popped out and caught Glare off guard. Unprepared, Glare's abdomen was hit hard. He felt as if his organs were about to split open. However, it was a good thing that the machine was still a bit high. If it was any lower, it would have hit his family jewels. That would be a real pain in the ass for Glare. Seeing his results, Hui Mao grinned and retreated. Sillin was already preparing to leave this base. Holding his stomach, Glare returned to the third lab area with a cold expression. He lay on the chair and used the healing device to treat the injuries caused by the attack just now. At the same time, he checked some things out of habit. Suddenly, Glare paused. After confirming again, a strange smile appeared on his face.